A potter's brush moves in slow bands around the belly of a clay jar. Meander, chevron, then a wider band where small dark figures appear. Ships, a duel, a man wrestling a lion. This is the 8th century before our era, and those figures are Greek mythology, the body of stories the ancient Greeks told about the origin of the world, the lives of the deities and the heroes. Why did a people who used myth to explain everything, the origin of the cosmos, the descent of their kings, the fissures in their own hillsides, eventually put those same stories on trial? And why did the stories outlive the trial to become the inheritance of the West? If these ancient stories help you rest, subscribe so the next story can find you at bedtime. The passage ahead is long and unhurried, and it moves the way the tradition itself moved. It begins in a yawning nothingness that the poets called chaos. It passes through 3 thrones and 3 overthrows, father against son, 3 times in succession. It descends to a river in the dark where the dead were said to gather without names. It comes out again at the walls of a city near the Dardanelles, and it ends in the cool hands of philosophers who read all of it carefully and called it old wives' chatter and could not put it down. Look a little longer at that jar. The bands of geometric ornament are the older habit, and the small figures are the newer thing, pushed into the frieze as though the pattern had grown a memory. Pottery of the 8th century BC carries scenes from the Trojan cycle and from the adventures of Heracles. The painter did not sign them. He did not label them. He assumed that whoever lifted the vessel would already know which duel this was, which lion, which shipload of men rowing away from which shore. And that assumption is the most interesting thing about the jar, because it means the stories were already old. They were already common property, already so widely held that a few strokes of slip on fired clay could summon them whole. Greek mythology is known to us primarily from literature and from images of the geometric period, roughly 900 to 800 years before our era, onward. But what survives from that window is not the birth of the myths, it is the moment they became visible. Before that, they were sound. They were breath in a hall, a voice above a fire, and nothing else at all. Turn from the jar to the word, because the Greeks had a word for that breath, and it does not mean what people now assume it means. Mythos meant speech, narrative, or fiction, not a lie, a telling. Joined to the suffix logia, meaning study, it makes mythologia, which is story, legends, storytelling, and the study of the same, all folded into one term. When scholars use the word myth today, they still hold to something close to that older sense. Myth is a genre of folklore, made mostly of narratives that play a fundamental role in a society. Whether the narrative is true is beside the point entirely. The veracity of a piece of folklore is irrelevant to whether it constitutes a myth. The Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko gave a definition that is quoted more often than most: a story of the gods, a religious account. There is a companion word that helps sharpen the edges. Legends deal, for the most part, with human beings. often leaders of some kind, but human. Myths deal with gods, demigods, and other beings who are not us. Myths usually have no historical basis, and they are set in a remote world, a past very different from the present. Creation myths take place in a primordial age, before the world had achieved its later form. Origin myths explain how a people's customs and institutions and taboos were established and made sacred. And many societies keep their myths, their legends, and their history in the same drawer, treating all three as factual accounts of a remote past. The Greeks kept them in that same drawer. Mythology was not an ornament on their lives. It sat at the center of everyday existence. They used myth to explain natural phenomena, to explain why one region's customs differed from another's, to explain why this city and that city had hated each other for generations, and why these two had always been friends. It was a matter of pride to be able to trace the descent of your leaders back to a hero or a god. And regarding the great war at Troy, as Homer's poems recounted it, few ever doubted that there was truth behind the account. Not a truth about lions or river spirits, a truth about ships and men and a coastline you could sail to. Hold that in mind, gently, as the story goes further back, because it is the thing that will later be taken away. Go back now, well past the jar, past the ships and the meander bands, to a time before any of it could be written. The myths were first propagated in an oral poetic tradition, most likely by Minoan and Mycenaean singers, beginning as early as the 18th century before our era. Think of what that number means. Between those first singers and the potter with his brush lies a stretch of 1,000 years, and across the whole of it, the stories moved from mouth to mouth, from one memory into the next, with nothing to hold them but rhythm. The earlier inhabitants of the Balkan Peninsula were an agricultural people. Their way of seeing the world is called animism. They assigned a spirit to every aspect of nature, not a god with a name and a temper and a family, at first. Something vaguer than that. The spirit of this spring, the spirit of that stand of oaks, the presence in the storm that comes down off the mountain in the late afternoon. A farmer's world is full of powers that must be reckoned with, and none of them are abstract. Rain arrives or it does not. The river rises or it stays in its bed. Slowly, over generations nobody recorded, those vague spirits assumed human forms. They acquired faces, then names, then relatives, and they entered the local mythology as gods. The presence in the spring became someone who could be addressed, and offended, and thanked. Then the peninsula changed hands. Tribes came down from the north, and they brought a pantheon of their own, and it was not a pantheon of springs and oaks. It was founded on conquest, on force, on prowess in battle, and on violent heroism. When two such worlds meet, the older gods do one of two things. Some of them fused with the gods of the more powerful newcomers, taking on their names or their attributes or their stories and surviving inside them. The rest simply faded into insignificance, not destroyed, not argued away, just spoken of less and less, until nobody remembered whose spring it had been. What emerged from that meeting is the deep foundation of everything that follows. Mycenaean religion appears to have been the mother of Greek religion. Its pantheon already included many of the divinities you would meet again centuries later in classical Greece, and the whole of it is generally understood to carry heavy influence from pre-Greek and from Near Eastern cultures. The Greeks did not invent their gods out of nothing. They inherited them, the way a house is inherited, with the previous family's furniture still in the rooms. Now the honest part, the part that a careful telling owes you. Nearly all of what has just been described is reconstruction, and the ground beneath it is thinner than one might like. At the Mycenaean and Minoan sites, the evidence about myths and rituals is entirely monumental. Walls, foundations, tombs, painted plaster, the shapes of rooms. Stone tells you that people gathered here, that something was poured out there, that this doorway was made to be approached in a particular way. Stone does not tell you the name of the god or the story that was told while the pouring was done. There was writing. The Linear B script, an early form of Greek, found both on Crete and on the mainland, survives on baked clay, but it was used mainly to record inventories, amounts of grain, numbers of sheep, quantities of oil, wheels, cloth, bronze. Among those lists, certain names of gods and heroes have been identified, and the careful word used for that identification is tentatively, a syllable cluster that may be a god's name, sitting in a column beside a figure for jars of oil. Someone, in a room in a palace that later burned, wrote down what was owed to a power whose story we cannot read. So the myths are known to us from later literature and later images, and here the sequence turns strange in a way that rewards a moment's attention. Many Greek myths are attested on vases earlier than in any literary source. The picture comes first. The text arrives afterward, sometimes much later. Of the 12 labors of Heracles, only one, the descent to fetch the hound Cerberus out of the house of the dead, occurs in a contemporary literary text. All the rest are painted before they are written, or painted where the writing has not survived. In some instances, the first known representation of a myth in geometric art precedes its first known appearance in late archaic poetry by several centuries. And there is a stranger category still. Visual sources sometimes represent myths or mythical scenes that appear in no surviving literature at all. A figure with a raised arm, a woman between two horses, a creature that is not any monster we have a name for, whole stories told confidently and beautifully in paint, whose plots are simply gone. Images existed on pottery and on religious artwork that were interpreted, and, more likely, misinterpreted, into many diverse myths and tales. Some of what later Greeks believed about their own past may have begun with somebody looking at an old picture and guessing wrong. If your eyes have closed by now, let them stay closed. The tale keeps going in the dark, and it was made for the dark to begin with. because at last a voice comes, and the voice has a name, and the name may belong to nobody. The two poems are the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it is thought they were composed at some point around the late 8th or early 7th century before our era. The Iliad turns on a quarrel, not a battle, a quarrel between King Agamemnon and the warrior Achilles during the last year of a long war. Its core describes 4 days and 2 nights out of a siege that had already lasted 10 years. The Odyssey chronicles a homeward journey of 10 years, belonging to Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who perseveres through the punishment of the gods and keeps moving toward a small rocky island he has not seen in 2 decades. The epics are known for tragic and serious themes, and rightly, but they are not solemn all the way through. There is comedy in them. There is laughter, sometimes among the gods themselves. The language of these poems exists nowhere else on earth. It is called Homeric Greek, or Epic Greek, and no one ever spoke it in the street. It is a literary language, a made thing, mixing features of the Ionic and the Aeolic dialects, drawn from different centuries and set side by side in the same line, with Eastern Ionic the predominant influence. Old words survive inside it because the meter needed them. Newer words sit beside them because the singer's own mouth supplied them. A poem in that language is a kind of sediment. You can hear several ages of Greek at once. Most researchers believe the poems were originally transmitted orally, that they were performed long before they were fixed in writing, which is precisely why the language has that layered quality. And the poet? Antiquity had an answer, and it is a lovely one. Homer was a blind bard from Ionia, that stretch of the western Anatolian coast in present-day Turkey, along with the islands of Chios and Samos. Blind in most of the ancient biographies. Blind and therefore seeing the war more clearly than the sighted. 2 of those old lives survive in reasonable shape. The life of Homer, attributed to a pseudo-Herodotus, and the contest of Homer and Hesiod. Others went further. The Byzantine encyclopedia, known as the Suda, offers a small crowd of possible ancestors for him, descended from one of the Muses, or from Apollo, or from Orpheus, or from Thamyris, or from Telemachus, or from Musaeus. When a people cannot find a poet's father, they will give him a god. Modern scholars consider all of those accounts legendary. Because Homer was anonymous, the biographical details grew more mythologized as antiquity went on. In that period, it was believed he lived after the Trojan War, and the stories about him accumulated exactly as stories about heroes accumulate. The plain statement is this: the identity of Homer is a mystery. Scholars generally regard the ancient conception of a single author standing behind both the Iliad and the Odyssey as a fictional narrative, and generally regard the 2 poems as the works of separate authors. The debate has a name of its own, the Homeric question, and it concerns authorship, origins, composition, and transmission. And it continues. By whom, when, where, and under what circumstances these poems were made is still argued over. The first faint traces of him in other people's writing come in the 7th century before our era, implicit references in Archilochus, in Alcman, in Tyrtaeus, in Calenus. Not quotations exactly, more like the way you can tell, from how someone speaks, which stories they grew up inside. Whoever he was, or whoever they were, the effect is not in doubt. The poems shaped ancient Greek culture and education, and fostered the ideals of heroism, glory, and honor by which people measured themselves. Plato, the same Plato who would one day call the old tales old wives' chatter, put it in 4 words: Homer has educated Greece. Homer was the education of Greece, and his poetry was simply the book. So the tradition arrives at its first great written monument, with its author missing, its language artificial, its stories already 1,000 years old, and its authority absolute. And the tradition was not finished. Almost at the same moment, in a farming district on the mainland, another poet was gathering something even older and even stranger. Not the fall of a city, but the beginning of everything, starting with a nothingness that had no flaw. His name was Hesiod, and he is usually placed as Homer's near contemporary, somewhere in the 8th or 7th century before our era. The dates are given that loosely, and no one has ever been able to tighten them. He left 2 poems. Between them they hold an account of the genesis of the world, the succession of divine rulers, the succession of human ages, the origin of human woes, and the origin of sacrificial practices. One is the Works and Days, a poem about farming life, full of advice on how to succeed in a dangerous world, made more dangerous still by its gods. The other is the Theogony, the births of the gods, and it is the one that reaches furthest back. The Theogony was composed somewhere around 730 to 700 before our era, in the epic dialect, and it runs to 1,022 lines. That is a small poem, as ancient poems go. You could hear the whole of it in an evening. Its written form was established in the 6th century BC, which means well over 100 years passed between the making of the poem and the settling of its text. A century in which the lines lived where they had always lived, in the mouths of men who performed them, changing a little the way anything changes when it is handled. What we read is the shape the poem had when someone finally held it still. Within that small compass, it does something no surviving Greek poem had done before. It is the first known Greek mythical cosmogony, and it is a large-scale synthesis of a vast variety of local traditions concerning the gods. Not the version told in one valley, but many versions gathered and set in order, arranged into a single narrative, telling how the gods came to be and how they established permanent control over the cosmos. Every district had its own powers, its own genealogies, its own peculiar rites. Hesiod took that scattered inheritance and gave it a spine. In formal terms, the poem is not a chronicle at all. It is a hymn, invoking Zeus and the Muses, and its opening bears a close family resemblance to the much shorter Homeric Hymn to the Muses. Parallel passages between the two make the relation plain. Both grew out of the same custom, the hymnic prelude, the descriptive piece with which a rhapsode began his performance at a poetic competition. He would stand up before a crowd, and before he gave them heroes or wars or homecomings, he would sing the god into the room. Gregory Nagy has described the larger Homeric hymns as simple preludes when set beside the theogony, each of them invoking one god, where Hesiod's prelude swelled until it swallowed the whole performance and became the poem itself. And inside that prelude, the poet does something quietly extraordinary. In the passage, scholars call Kings and Singers, lines 80 to 103, Hesiod takes to himself the authority ordinarily reserved for sacred kingship. Earlier, near the poem's opening, he says the Muses gave him two gifts, a sceptre and an authoritative voice. Those are the visible signs of a king. A sceptre is what a man holds when the assembly must fall silent and listen. The point of the passage is not that Hesiod is claiming a throne or land or the right to judge disputes at the gate. The point is that the authority which belonged to kingship has moved. It now belongs to the poetic voice declaiming the poem. Whoever speaks these lines holds the scepter while he speaks them. It's one of the oldest claims a poet ever made for poetry, and it is made in passing, in a few lines, by a man who elsewhere writes about ploughing. Nor was he alone in thinking a theogony was the highest thing a singer could attempt. The earliest Greek thought about poetry treated theogonies as the prototypical poetic genre, the prototypical Mythos, and imputed almost magical powers to them. Orpheus, the archetypal poet, is also the archetypal singer of theogonies in the Argonautica of Apollonius. He uses one to calm seas and storms, and in his descent to the house of the dead, he uses one to move the stony hearts of the underworld gods. When Hermes invents the lyre in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, the very first thing he does with it, before anything else at all, is sing about the birth of the gods. To sing how the world came to be was the act by which an instrument was inaugurated and a storm was quieted. Other theogonies existed too, whole poems attributed to Orpheus, to Musaeus, to Epimenides, to Abaris and other legendary seers, used in private purifications and mystery rites. Nearly all of them are lost. Hesiod survives, and because it survives, it is often mistaken for the law. It is better understood as a snapshot of a living tradition that happened to crystallize at the moment one man formulated the myths he knew. The tradition kept moving afterward. It had been moving long before. So let the room where the poem was sung go dark, and let the poem begin where it begins, with a word for the absence of everything. Chaos, not disorder in the modern sense, not a churning of matter, but a yawning nothingness, a dark and indefinite void, and the Greeks regarded it as a divine primordial condition, the state from which everything else afterward appeared. There is no maker standing outside it. There is no command, no craftsman, no first word spoken over the deep. There's a gap, and the gap is holy, and out of it things come. Next came Gaia, the earth, and Hesiod gives her a phrase that has never been improved upon, the ever-sure foundation of all. After the gap, a floor, something at last that will hold weight, that will not shift, that everything after can be built upon and buried in. Then Tartarus, in the depth of the wide-pathed earth, a below beneath the below, made almost in the same breath as the ground itself. The world acquires a cellar before it acquires a sky. Remember that, because a great deal will end up down there. Then Eros, fairest among the deathless gods, not a child with arrows. That is a much later picture. This is the force by which separate things are drawn together and make more things, and it has to exist before any pairing can happen, so it is placed at the beginning as a condition of the rest. And then, without any male assistance, Gaia gave birth to Uranus, the sky, and Uranus, having been born from her, then fertilized her. The sequence is strange to modern ears and entirely coherent on its own terms. The earth produces her own covering, an equal, something as wide as herself to lie over her, and from that first pairing of ground and sky, everything with a face and a name will descend. What you are hearing, when you hear those 4 or 5 names in order, is an attempt to explain the beginnings of the universe in human language. It was the most widely accepted version of its day, and although it arrives as a story, with parents and children and rage and blood, it is doing the work of philosophy. Void, then ground, then depth, then attraction, then the pairing that makes multiplicity. Strip the names away, and you have a sequence of conditions. Leave the names on, and you have a family, which is easier to remember, easier to sing, and easier to argue with. The Greeks would eventually do all 3. From the union of Gaia and Uranus came the Titans, 12 of them. 6 were male: Eus, Creus, Cronus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Oceanus. 6 were female: Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Rhea, Thea, Themis, and Tethys. Say those names slowly, and some of them will be familiar as concepts rather than persons. Mnemosyne is memory, and will be the mother of the Muses. Themis is right custom, the order of things, and turns up later on Olympus in the Iliad, which makes her a Titan and an Olympian at once. Oceanus is the great encircling river. These are not minor figures pushed aside by the later gods. They are the furniture of the cosmos. After the Titans came others, the Cyclopes, one-eyed, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, 3 of them, each with 100 arms, which is not a monster so much as a quantity, a description of overwhelming force in the only vocabulary available. Here, the tradition splits, and the 2 halves cannot be reconciled, so both should be set down plainly. In one account, after Cronus was born, Gaia and Uranus decreed that no more Titans were to be born, The Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones followed, and Uranus threw both groups down into Tartarus. And this made Gaia furious. In the Theogony zone framing, the count is different and so is the cruelty. Uranus produced 18 children with his mother Gaia, the 12 Titans, the 3 Cyclopes, the 300-handers, and hating them, hid them all away somewhere inside her body. Not a prison beneath the earth then, but the earth herself used as a prison. Every child pressed back into the mother who bore them. None of them permitted to be born into the open. The versions disagree about how many were confined and where they were put. They agree completely about what it did to Gaia. Angry and in distress, she fashioned a sickle. Picture the object rather than the deed, a curved blade, the shape a farmer uses at harvest, made by the earth out of her own substance and offered to her children. She asks which of them will use it. The others hesitate. Cronus does not. The wily one, the youngest and most terrible of Gaia's children, and it is the poem itself that calls him that, so we are told what to think of him before he lifts a hand. He takes the sickle and he castrates his father, and the sky is separated from the earth, and the first order of the world ends. Ancient telling handles what follows with a certain coolness, and there is no reason to do otherwise. Cronus became ruler of the Titans. His sister Rhea became his consort and his wife. The remaining Titans became his court. A generation that had been hidden or imprisoned now sits in council, and the one who wielded the blade sits at the head of it. This pattern was not only Greek. When Hittite mythical texts were deciphered, the one called Kingship in Heaven was first presented in 1946. Scholars found in the figure of Kumarbi an Anatolian parallel to the conflict of Uranus and Cronus, carrying the same castration motif. Hesiod was probably influenced by some Near Eastern traditions, such as the Babylonian dynasty of Dunham, mixed into local material, though these are more likely lingering traces carried down from the Mycenaean world than the result of contacts in Hesiod's own lifetime. The philologist Georges Dumézil set the Greek Uranus beside the Sanskrit Varuna and drew a comparison, without any hint that he believed the two originally connected. Somewhere behind the sickle, there may be a much older story, told in languages that had no name for Greece. Now the second turn of the wheel, and it turns because of what Cronus knows about himself. Because he had betrayed his own father, he feared his own offspring would do the same to him. It is a perfectly logical fear, and it is the reasoning of a man who has learned only one thing from his history. So each time Rhea gave birth, he snatched up the child and ate it, not killed, swallowed, kept, held inside him, which is the same solution his father reached, only turned inward. Uranus hid his children in the body of the earth. Cronus hid his in the body of the king. Rhea hated this. The word the tradition uses is plain and unsoftened. She hated it, and she tricked him. When Zeus was born, she hid the child away, and she took a stone and wrapped it in a baby's blanket and handed it to her husband, and he swallowed it. He was so certain of the shape of the danger that he never looked at the thing he was destroying. The stone stayed in his stomach. Years passed. The poem does not linger on them, and Zeus grew to his full size somewhere out of his father's sight. When he was grown, he came back and fed Cronus a drugged drink, and the drink caused him to vomit. Out came Rhea's other children, one after another: Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, swallowed as infants and disgorged whole, and in the logic of the story they are not damaged, because gods are not damaged the way we are. And out came the stone as well, which had been sitting in his stomach all that time, unchanged, patient, the only thing in the cosmos that had never been alive and never needed to be. There is the heart of the whole poem, and it goes by a name: the succession myth. How Cronus overthrew Uranus, how Zeus in turn overthrew Cronus and the other titans, how Zeus came at last to be established as the final and permanent ruler of the cosmos. It is the same motion 3 times, father against son, and each ruler falls precisely because of what he does to prevent falling. Uranus buries his children, and his children come out of the ground for him. Cronus eats his children, and they come back up his throat. The world does not get better across those 3 generations. It gets more secure, which is a different thing, and the poem knows it. If your attention has begun to loosen, let it. You are not required to keep hold of the names. The story has been carrying itself for a very long time without anyone's help. What followed the drugged cup was war. Zeus challenged his father for the kingship of the gods, and it was fought for 10 years, 1 generation of immortals against the one before it. Zeus and his siblings on one side, and on the other the Titans, children of Gaia and Uranus, who had held the world since the Sickle fell. 10 years is not a number chosen for realism. It is the length the Greeks gave to any struggle that could not be resolved by strength alone. The same span they gave to the siege of a city near the Dardanelles, and to a king's journey home from it. A war of 10 years means a war that goes on until something other than fighting decides it. What decided this one was an act of release. Zeus went down to Tartarus and freed the Cyclopes, who had been thrown into that depth by the previous order and had been sitting in it ever since. Whether they had been cast down after the Titans were born, or hidden inside Gaia and only later confined, the sources part ways, as they parted ways before. They were in the dark, and they had been put there by the fathers. Zeus opened the door. With their help, he and his siblings were victorious. And then the door closed the other way. Cronus and the Titans were hurled down into Tartarus, into the depth of the wide-pathed earth, that cellar which had existed before there was anyone to put in it. The place the first hidden children had been thrown became the place their jailers were kept. The sequence is neat enough to be deliberate. Whoever holds the cosmos decides who lives beneath it, and every ruler in this poem, sooner or later, is on the wrong side of that floor. Even the text of what came next is unsettled. The episode that follows the war in our manuscripts, the confrontation with the monster Typhon, at lines 8 and 20 to 868, has been judged an interpolation even by some conservative editors, a later hand adding a last enemy after the real one had been defeated. The poem that gave the cosmos its order has an uncertain seam in it, right at the place where the order is being finished. Zeus, in any case, was now king. He had watched his grandfather lose the sky to a son, and his father lose the throne to a son, and he had been the son both times over. No one in that lineage had ever found a way to hold power without also holding a fear, and the fear had always been the thing that undid them. Whether Zeus had learned anything the others had not is the question the next part of the poem takes up, and its answer arrives from an unexpected direction, through a wife, a prophecy, and a headache. His first wife was Metis, and her name is also a Greek noun, cunning intelligence, the kind of shrewdness that finds the seam in a problem rather than breaking it open. She had been useful to him. The drugged cup that emptied his father is credited in some tellings to exactly that sort of counsel. And then the warning came, one of those pieces of foreknowledge that arrive in the old poems without a messenger, simply known the way weather is known. The offspring of Metis would be a god greater than he. Greater than he. 4 words, and every king in that lineage had already lost a throne to a sentence like it. So Zeus swallowed her, not a child this time, the mother, whole, before there was a visible child to take. He had watched 2 kings before him wait for the birth, and then act, and he had seen how that ended, and his correction was to act earlier. Where his grandfather had used the ground, and his father had used his own belly as a cell, Zeus used his own body to absorb the very faculty that had helped him win. The wisest thing he knew went inside him and did not come out, except that she was already pregnant. The daughter grew where her mother had been put, and when the time came, she did not come out the way anything else in the world comes out. Athena burst forth from her father's head, fully grown and dressed for war. No infancy, no nursing, no long concealment on a hillside. She arrives finished, armed, at the height of the god who swallowed the possibility of her, and she arrives as an ally. That is the whole difference between this story and the 2 that came before it. The greater one was born, as the warning said. The line simply bent so that she stood beside the throne instead of over it. And so the succession myth closes, and it is worth seeing it whole for a moment before the poem hands the world over to its permanent management. 3 rulers, 3 fears of the same shape, 3 hiding places for what was feared. First, the body of the mother, then the belly of the king, then the head of the king. The first 2 openings were forced from outside by a blade and by a cup. The third opened by itself, and what came out of it was not a rival, but a daughter with a war helmet on. Zeus was established from that point as the final and permanent ruler of the cosmos. Permanent is the word the tradition uses, and it earns it. No 4th overthrow comes. But permanent is not the same as almighty, and the poems never once pretend otherwise. He has a level of control over all the others. He does not have everything, and what he lacks will matter before this is over. Let that settle for a moment, because the poem that carried all of it now needs to be put in its proper place, and its proper place is smaller than most people assume. A single surviving text has a way of turning into a scripture simply by being the only one left standing. The birth poem of the gods is not that. It is a snapshot, a dynamic tradition that happened to crystallize at the moment one man in a farming district formulated the myths he happened to know, and the tradition went on evolving long after his lines were fixed. You have already heard how one of its most famous episodes sits under suspicion as a later Hans addition, and how the shape of the first castration turns up again in Anatolian and Babylonian company. Those are the visible seams. What matters more is the invisible one, running the whole length of the poem. The descriptions of individual gods in Greece arise from a multiplicity of archaic local variants which do not always agree with one another. Not variants of emphasis, variants of fact, whose daughter she was, where he was born, which of them held the older right. The Greeks knew this about themselves, and the knowledge produced a peculiar kind of book. Of all the mythographical handbooks antiquity must have produced, only one general one survives from Greek antiquity: the library. That passes under the name of Pseudo-Apollodorus. Apollodorus of Athens, who lived roughly from 125 before our era, wrote on many of these subjects, and his work may have formed the basis of the collection, but the library discusses events that occurred long after his death, which is why the name carries that cautious prefix, and its whole labor is reconciliation. It attempts to bring the contradictory tales of the poets into some kind of agreement, and to lay out a grand summary of the traditional mythology and heroic legends. Someone sat down in a room with too many versions and tried to make them one version. The very existence of that effort tells you what the material was actually like. There were other cosmogonies too, and one of them stopped being a rumor within living memory. A scrap of papyrus, charred and unwound, proves that at least in the 5th century before our era, a theogonic and cosmogonic poem attributed to Orpheus was genuinely in existence, not merely referred to by later writers, but there, in a text someone owned. There are indications that Plato was familiar with some version of that Orphic account, so a reader in Athens might have had two rival births of the world available, and no authority anywhere to tell him which was the correct one. The comparisons reach further than Greece, and they get thinner the further they reach. Set the Greek Moirai, the Fates, the three who apportion, beside the Norns of the Norse North, and the parallel in character and function is close enough to suggest a common inheritance. Suggest is as far as it goes. The linguistic evidence that would prove it is missing, and without that thread, the resemblance stays a resemblance. Some doors in this subject are open, some are locked, and a few are simply painted on the wall. With the elder generation shut beneath the floor of the world, the poem confirms the new household. The Olympians take their residence on Mount Olympus under the eye of Zeus, a race of deities consisting mostly of the third and fourth generation of immortals, which is a plain way of saying that the gods you have heard of are latecomers. The most important cluster is the first generation of Olympians, the children of Cronus and Rhea, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, Hestia. To them are added the principal offspring of Zeus, Aphrodite, Athena, Artemis, Apollo, Ares, Hephaestus, Hermes, Dionysus. Hades, brother to the eldest of them, and no lesser power, held a realm far from that summit, and was not usually counted in their number at all. Count the names just given, and you get 13. The canonical number is 12. The mismatch is not an error in the telling, it is in the sources, and it has been there all along. The 12th seat belongs either to Hestia or to Dionysus, depending on which authority you are reading, the quiet goddess of the hearth, or the god who comes from outside and cannot be refused. Nobody ever adjudicated between them. The tidiness dissolves further the closer you look at when it appeared. The limitation of the god's number to 12 seems to have been a comparatively modern idea, and the earliest evidence of any Greek practice involving 12 gods, the Dodecatheon, from Dodeca, 12, and Theo, gods, comes no earlier than the late 6th century before our era. That is centuries after the poems. Across ancient Greece, there were many cultic groupings of 12 gods, with varying members, which is to say that the number was fixed and the contents were not. Two settings make it concrete. In the Agora of Athens, there stood an altar of the 12 gods, established, according to Thucydides, by the Archon Pisistratus, son of Hippias, grandson of the tyrant of the same name, around 522 before our era. It became something more than a shrine. Distances from Athens were measured from that altar. It was the point from which the road lengths of a whole territory were reckoned. It was also a place of supplication and refuge, where a person in danger could go and put a hand on the stone, a civic center and a sanctuary in one small structure, and the 12 gods holding both meanings at once. The other setting is a riverbank in the Homeric hymn to Hermes. From about 500 before our era, the newborn god steals 2 cows from Apollo and, on the banks of the Alpheus, divides the sacrifice into 12 portions. 12 parts, apportioned by a god who is himself one of the recipients. Glad-hearted, the hymn says, as he drags the rich meats he has prepared. Olympia, in that same region, appears to have had its own early tradition of 12. And Olympus was never only 12, whatever the altars said. Themis is up there in the Iliad, holding her double citizenship. The children of Styx are up there, zealous, envy, Nike, victory, Kratos, strength, Bia, force. And Hesiod says of them that they have no house apart from Zeus, nor any dwelling nor path except that wherein God leads them, but they dwell always with Zeus. Not guests, then, and not quite persons either. Attributes of rule given legs, following the king because they have nowhere else to be. Heracles is up there after his apotheosis with his wife Hebe. So are the Horae and the Graces and the Muses. So are Aletheia, who attends births, and Iris, who carries messages, and Dione and Ganymede. The mountain is crowded in a way that no list of 12 has ever managed to contain. Diodorus Siculus preserves the most telling detail of all. Some said that Heracles was offered a place among the 12 and refused it because his acceptance would have meant one of the original 12 being cast out. Even inside the myth, the number was understood as a fixed quantity of seats rather than a description of who was actually there. Now come down off the bright summit, because that is not where most Greeks spent their days. The country a farmer walked through was populated. Pan, the satyr god, was in the rough ground and the flocks. Nymphs were the spirits of rivers. Naiads dwelled in springs. The particular spring, the one at the bottom of your own field, not springs in general. Dryads were the spirits of trees, and Nereids inhabited the sea, and there were river gods, with their own names and their own tempers, and satyrs in the wild places. A person could pass a whole ordinary life addressing powers of this kind and rarely trouble the Olympians at all. The older animism never disappeared. It simply carried on underneath the great families, in the places where water came out of rock. Beneath all of it were the dark powers. The Erinyes, whom later ages call the Furies, were said to pursue those guilty of crimes against blood relatives, not crimes in general, but the specific horror of harm done inside a family. A murderer of strangers had the city to fear. A man who killed his own had something else on his track, and it did not stop. The architecture of practice followed the same double pattern. The most impressive temples tended to be dedicated to a limited number of gods, the focus of large cults drawing worshippers from across the Greek world. Meanwhile, individual regions and villages devoted their own cults to minor gods whose names traveled no further than a valley. And even the famous gods were not the same god everywhere. Many cities honored them with unusual local rites and attached strange myths to them, stories unknown anywhere else, which a visitor from the next region would have heard for the first time standing in the sanctuary. Nothing coordinated this. There was no centralization of authority over Greek practices and beliefs at all. Change was regulated only at the civic level, city by city, custom by custom. No council, no canon, no correction from above. What held it together was resemblance rather than rule, a group of closely related religious dialects, resembling each other far more than they resembled those of non-Greeks. Which is precisely why Herodotus could say what he said of the Hellenes, that they had common shrines of the gods and sacrifices, and the same kinds of customs. Not one practice, one family of practices, mutually intelligible, the way two accents of the same language are. If the day is finally letting go of you, let it go. The gods will still be here in a moment, and they are patient by construction. What were they, though? These persons in the springs and on the summit? The Greek answer is unusually physical. The gods have bodies, essentially corporeal, but ideal ones. They are not affected by disease. They can be wounded, but only under highly unusual circumstances, and the wounding is remembered forever afterward because it is so nearly impossible. What distinguished them in Greek eyes was immortality, and immortality was maintained, not merely possessed. The constant use of nectar and ambrosia ensured both the deathlessness and the unfading youth, renewing the divine blood in their veins. Even eternity in this system required a table and a cup. Walter Burkert put the defining trait of Greek anthropomorphism in a single line. The Greek gods are persons, not abstractions, ideas or concepts. That is the whole of it. They are not the idea of love or the principle of war. They are somebody with a lineage, a temper, a set of interests, and a grudge or two. Though the degree of personhood varies enormously, Apollo and Dionysus reveal complex personalities and mixtures of functions, one god holding music and plague and prophecy together, another holding wine and ecstasy and the terrible arrival of the unrecognized. At the other end stand figures who are little more than personifications: Hestia, whose name simply means hearth, and Helios, whose name simply means sun. Between the two poles sits everyone else. And when a Greek actually addressed them, in poetry, in prayer, at an altar, he rarely used a bare name. He used the name with an epithet, and the epithet did real work, marking off one manifestation of the god from another. Apollo Musagetes is Apollo as leader of the Muses, which is a different Apollo from the one who sends arrows. Other epithets identify a particular and localized aspect, a version of the god belonging to one place, and some of those were already felt to be ancient in the classical age. Set against all that power, one limit. The gods were not all good, and they were not all powerful. They had human vices, and a fair number of them behaved with less morality than an ordinary person would. They quarreled and took sides against each other. Above them stood fate, the Moirai, which overrode any divine power or will whatsoever, not as a stronger god, but as a condition of the world that even the Sky King inhabits. The clearest illustration the tradition offers is a small one. It was Odysseus's fate to return home to Ithaca after the war. The gods who disliked him could not cancel that. What they could do was lengthen the journey and make it harder. 10 years of harder, sea after sea, loss after loss, and every one of those years was real, and none of them changed the destination. That is the exact size of divine power in Greek myth, enormous inside the corridor, and unable to move the walls. So it helps to know what the walls looked like, what shape the world had, for the people who first heard these poems in a hall. The earth was a flat disk. It floated on the river of Oceanus, which ran all the way round its rim and had no far bank, and which was also a god, since a river of that size could hardly be anything less. Over the disk arched a hemispherical sky, and the sky carried the sun, the moon, and the stars across it, the way a bowl carries what has been set inside it. There is nothing crude about this picture. It accounts for everything a person standing in a field can actually see: the flatness underfoot, the curve overhead, the lights that rise on one side and go down on the other, and the water at the world's edge that sailors kept reporting and never came to the end of. The sun moved because someone drove him. Helios traversed the heavens as a charioteer, up the long slope of the morning and down the other side, and at night, this is the part that catches in the memory, he sailed around the earth in a golden bowl, not under it, through some tunnel. Around it, on the encircling river, floating in a vessel of gold from the western rim to the eastern one, so that he would be in place again before dawn. The sun goes home by sea while you sleep. Somebody looked at the horizon where the light goes out, and at the horizon where the light comes back, and joined the two with the only vehicle that made sense. These were not merely scenery. Sun, earth, heaven, rivers, and winds could be addressed in prayers, and they could be called to witness oaths. A man swearing to keep a bargain did not need a building or a priest. He needed the daylight, the ground he was standing on, the wind moving through the olives, and the river he had drunk from that morning. And he named them out loud, and they heard him. It's a startlingly practical arrangement. The witnesses to a promise are the things that cannot leave, cannot be bribed, and will still be there when the promise comes due. And the ground had openings in it. All through Greek country there are natural fissures, cracks in limestone, sudden fractures at the base of a slope, places where cold air comes up out of the rock even at midday. These were popularly regarded as entrances, not symbols of entrances, entrances to the subterranean house of Hades and of those who ruled the dead before him, which is where the dead had gone. A shepherd could walk past one on an ordinary afternoon. The doorway to the other realm was not distant, not sealed behind a wall of fire. It was in the next field over, and it exhaled. Which places Hades precisely, and the placement matters more than most retellings allow. He was a major deity and a brother of Zeus, of the same birth and the same generation as the eldest of those who took the mountain. But his realm lay far away from Olympus, and for that reason he was not usually counted among the Olympians at all. He is not a lesser god. He is an absent one, a king whose court happens to be somewhere no one visits. You can see the distinction most clearly in the way people gave him things. Sacrifice to an Olympian was made at an altar, and it went upward, the fat and the smoke rising off the stone into the open air where the recipient was assumed to be. The chthonic gods, Hades and his wife Persephone, among them, received their offerings downward, into a bothros, a pit, or into a megaron, a sunken chamber. The same animal, the same care, the same prayers, and the entire gesture reversed. One household is fed by lifting, the other by pouring into the dark. A visitor who knew nothing else about a sanctuary could tell which power it served by watching which way the hands moved. The first philosophical cosmologists would later react against this whole picture, and sometimes build upon it, but the picture was there long before them, and it is the one the poems assume. Disk, river, bowl of sky, golden boat, and a cellar with cracks in its ceiling. Go down through one of those cracks now, and the going down is the whole subject. The underworld is a distinct realm, one of the three that make up the cosmos, alongside the sky and the sea and the lit surface where people live. What arrives there is not the body. At the moment of death, an individual's essence, the psyche, is separated from the corpse and carried down, and the corpse stays where it fell, to be washed and burned or buried by whoever loved it. Two things happen at once at a Greek deathbed, and only one of them is visible. In the earliest poems, what waited below was not a court and not a punishment. The dead were grouped together indiscriminately, all of them, the just and the cruel, the famous and the forgotten, in one undifferentiated crowd, and what they had was a shadowy post-existence. Not torment, not reward, continuation, thinned almost to nothing, in a place with no sun in it. It's a bleak vision, and it is also strangely level. Kingship does not survive the crossing, and neither does disgrace. The sorting came later. In the later material, and notably in Platonic philosophy, elements of post-mortem judgment begin to appear, with good and bad separated from one another, separated spatially, in different regions of the realm, and separated in how they are treated once they arrive. The idea that death examines you is not the old Greek idea. It's a development, and it arrived long after the crowd of shades had been described. Where the realm sits is answered two ways, and the two are held together without embarrassment. It lies at the periphery of the earth, either associated with the outer limits of the ocean, out past where the river of Oceanus runs, or else beneath the earth, under the ground you are lying on, edge or depth. In a world shaped like a disk, the farthest place and the lowest place are cousins. Both mean beyond the reach of the light. Darkness is the constant. The absence of sunlight is the feature named more often than any other, and it works as a double contrast against the ordinary life of the living, where the sun crosses over daily and the day is the unit of everything, and against the brightness associated with Mount Olympus, which is the other pole of the cosmos entirely, the summit that catches the light first in the morning and holds it last in the evening. Between the bright peak and the lightless depth, the whole moral geography of the tradition is laid out without a single word of doctrine. There is one more quality, and it is the subtlest. The realm is invisible, not merely dark, unseeable. That understanding rests partly on the permanent absence of light, and partly on a possible etymology. Hades read as the unseen place, the god's name and the region's name carrying the same suggestion of what cannot be looked at. A realm that is not hidden behind anything. It is simply not available to the eye, in the way that a thing you have forgotten is not available to the memory. Let your own eyes stay shut through this part, if they have already gone. Nothing down here requires watching. The ways in were several, and the most familiar of them arrived late. Charon is the ferryman, and the picture is fixed in everyone's mind. The pole, the flat boat, the dark water, the passenger who does not speak. Perhaps the most common depiction of entry into the realm is exactly that, the ferryman taking the dead across the river. And yet Charon does not feature in the earliest mythical sources at all. He is difficult to date much earlier than the 6th century before our era, perhaps the very latest of the inhabitants of that realm to appear. The oldest poems get their dead down there without him. He is a newcomer who has spent 2,500 years being mistaken for the oldest thing in the story. Once he arrived, though, he took hold. On the white ground lekythoi of 5th century Athens, the slender oil flasks made for the grave, painted on a chalk-pale ground that suited them and nothing else. Charon is a common motif. Those vessels were not made for a table. They were made to be carried to a tomb by someone in mourning and left there, and the scene painted on the side is what that person wanted to have in mind. Often it is the ferryman at his boat, waiting, with the water indicated by a few lines. The alternative on those same flasks is a guide rather than a boatman. Hermes, in the role that names him Psychopompos, the conductor of souls, could be relied upon to lead the deceased down. He appears first in the 24th book of the Odyssey, and thereafter he is everywhere on the funeral vases, a god who is already the messenger, already the crosser of thresholds, taking one more traveler along a road he knows. Between the two images, there is a real difference of feeling. A ferryman is a stranger you pay. A guide is someone walking beside you. The realm was known for its gates. The phrase, "the gates of Hades," recurs through the Iliad and the Odyssey, like a fixture of the landscape, and one of the god's own epithets is the gate fastener, not the judge, not the tormentor, the one who closes the door and sees that it stays closed. His authority is custodial. What comes in does not go back out, and that is his office. Which is why burial mattered so much, and why the poems ache over it. There was a superstition that the unburied could not cross over until they had received proper rites, that the psyche would be left waiting at the threshold, refused, while its body lay unattended in the open. The two most famous instances stand at the center of the Iliad. Patroclus and Hector, both dead, both for a time denied the ordinary offices owed to the dead, and it is the ghost of Patroclus himself who speaks of the gates, and of a river he does not name, in one of the oldest descriptions we have of the place. He comes to ask for what he needs. The dead in these poems are not frightening, they are pleading. Rivers are fundamental to the ground plan, and they are present in the earliest sources before Charon existed to be poled across them. In the Odyssey, the shade of Anticlea, Odysseus's mother, who died while he was away and whom he meets below without expecting to, describes to her son what surrounds them: many great rivers and appalling streams. At least 4 are specifically referred to. The wider tradition offers more, and the count changes as you move from author to author. The number and combination of underworld waters vary depending on which source you have in your hands, and the names themselves can be read as carrying particular associations with death. Of all of them, the Styx is the most prominent and the most familiar, the one that was sworn by and the one that everybody could name. There is no need to hold the rivers in order. Even the Greeks could not agree on how many there were. A very few went down alive and came back up. The word for that journey is katabasis, and the tradition allows it to almost nobody, because the realm is made solely for the dead and the living have no business in it. Heracles went down for the hound. Theseus went down. Orpheus went down. Possibly Odysseus, at the edge of it, where he spoke to his mother, and in the later Roman depictions, Aeneas. 5 names out of every mortal who ever lived in the imagination of a whole civilization. The door is not merely shut. It is shut in a way that only a handful of stories were ever permitted to pretend around. Of those 5, 1 went down carrying nothing but a song, and what he did with it opens onto the oldest Greek idea about what poetry is for. Orpheus arrives at the boundary with no weapon and no plan of force. He does not fight the gatekeeper. He does not bargain with an army behind him. He performs, and what he performs, in the tradition's own account of him, is the birth of the gods. He sings the world's own beginning back to the powers who administer its ending, and it works. The stony hearts of the gods below are moved, which is the only recorded instance of anything of the kind. The same instrument had already flattened a sea for him on the voyage of the Argo. Weather and death, the 2 things no one negotiates with, and a singer sets both of them down. Behind that image lies a conviction that the Greeks held very early and never entirely let go, that the account of how things came to be was the prototypical poetic act, the prototypical mythos, and that it carried something close to magic. This is why so many of the lost poems were theogonies. Whole works stood under the names of Orpheus, of Musaeus, of Epimenides, of Abaris, and other legendary seers, and they were not entertainments. They were put to use in private ritual purifications and in mystery rites, where a small number of people gathered for something that was not the business of the city and was not spoken about afterward. Almost none of it survives. What we have comes in 2 thin forms: quotations preserved by Neoplatonist philosophers who cited the old theogonies for their own purposes many centuries later, and scraps of papyrus recovered from the ground. There is also a later collection, the Orphic Hymns, a set of pre-classical poetic compositions attributed to that same figure, who was himself the subject of a famous story, a poet who left poems and who is also a myth, and the 2 are impossible to separate. under all of it sits an ambition that outlived every one of the poems. Theogonies are the part of Greek mythology embodying the desire to articulate reality as a whole, to give an account not of a battle or a homecoming or a family, but of the entire universe and its coming into being in a single continuous utterance. That universalizing impulse was fundamental to the first projects of speculative theorizing, and it has never actually stopped. Someone singing a genealogy of the void beside a fire, and someone in a later century trying to describe the whole of things in a different vocabulary are doing a version of the same work. What the singers of theogonies also achieved, almost as a side effect, was time. Epic poetry created story cycles, clusters of tales grouped around a hero or an event, with the relationships between them fixed, and out of those cycles came a new sense of mythological chronology. Greek mythology stopped being a collection and became a sequence, a phase in the development of the world and of human beings, with a before and an after. Roughly, it divides into 4 periods. First, the myths of origin, the age of gods, the births. Second, the age when gods and mortals mingled freely and moved through the same landscape without much distance between them. Third, the age of heroes, in which divine activity had grown more limited. And fourth, if you count it separately as some researchers do, the Trojan War and everything that came home from it. The framework should be held loosely. Self-contradictions inside the stories make an absolute timeline impossible. Not difficult, impossible. Too many versions place the same figure in incompatible generations. The 4 ages are a way of walking through the material, not a calendar that anyone in antiquity could have hung on a wall. And Greek taste, when it came to those 4, was not divided. Modern students of myth have often been most drawn to the age of gods, to the cosmogonies and the succession and the void. The Greek authors of the archaic and classical eras had a clear preference for the age of heroes. Once the question of how the world came into being had been answered, what they wanted was the chronology and the record of human accomplishment. What was done, by whom, at which city, and in whose lifetime. The evidence sits in the sheer size of what survives. Set the Iliad and the Odyssey. Beside the birth poem of the gods and the 33 songs of the Homeric hymns, and the heroic poems dwarf the divine ones in length and in popularity, which is the harder measure and the more telling one. The stories of the gods are the foundation. The stories of men in front of a wall are what people asked for again and again. That preference did more than fill the shelves. Under the influence of Homer, the cult of heroes rose, and its rise restructured spiritual life. The change shows up as a separation, and the separation is the one you have already been walking through. The realm of the gods, set apart from the realm of the dead, the Olympian, divided from the chthonic, bright summit and unseen place, altar and pit, smoke lifting and libation, soaking down into the ground. Two kinds of power, two kinds of address, two directions for the hands. And in the middle of that new arrangement stood a figure who belonged to both sides of it at once, whose exploits the tradition regarded as the very dawn of the heroic age, and who is the only Greek hero for whom no grave was ever pointed out. Before that figure steps into the light, there is a second poem to open, and it smells of dust and barley rather than of the void. Hesiod's other work is the Works and Days, and it is a didactic poem about farming life. Not a hymn, not a genealogy of the powers, a book of counsel addressed to a man who has to get a crop in, when to plow, when to hold off, how to deal with a neighbor, how to conduct yourself so that the year does not close over your head. The poet advises on the best way to succeed in a dangerous world, and his particular understanding is that the danger is not only weather and debt and thieves. The world is rendered yet more dangerous by its gods. That is the premise the whole poem rests on. You are farming a slope beneath powers who are not obliged to be reasonable, and prudence is therefore a religious skill as much as an agricultural one. Into that practical book, Hesiod set some of the strangest material in Greek literature. He uses a scheme of ages or races of humankind told in metals, golden, silver, bronze, and iron. The old accounts do not even agree on how to count them. The scheme is described sometimes as 4 ages, sometimes as 5, and the disagreement is in the sources rather than in the telling. What matters more than the arithmetic is the thing that makes this scheme unlike almost every later imitation of it. These races are not descendants of one another. They are separate creations of the gods, made each in turn and then finished with. The golden race belongs to the reign of Kronos, made under that first dispensation before the drugged cup and the 10-year war. The races that follow belong to the creation of Zeus. So the sequence is not a decline within a family. It is a series of attempts. One kind of human being is made and lives out its span, then that kind ends, and another kind is made under a different management of the sky. A man in an Iron Age field, listening to this poem, was not being told that his great-grandfathers had been better than he was. He was being told that the golden people had been a different creation entirely, in a world that had a different king in it, and that whatever their ease had been, no road ran back to it, because the road would have to pass through a change of rulers. And in the same poem stands the account of where trouble came from. The presence of evil was explained by the myth of Pandora, and the object at the center of it is a jar, not a box. That is a later mistranslation with a long life. A jar, the ordinary storage vessel of a household, the kind that stood in the corner of every farm in Greece, holding oil or grain, wide-bellied, heavy, awkward to move, and easy to tip. All of the best of human capabilities were inside it, and the jar was overturned, and they spilled out and were gone. All of them, save hope. Hope stayed. Read it slowly, and it refuses to settle into a single meaning, which is probably why it has lasted. The good things are not destroyed, they are released, scattered, no longer at hand. And the one thing left in the vessel is the one thing a farmer needs to get through a bad winter, and also the one thing that keeps a person planting in ground that has failed him twice already. Whether hope remained as a mercy or as a last cruelty, the poem does not say. It puts the jar down and moves on to advice about the ploughing season. The scheme traveled, centuries later, in the Metamorphoses. Ovid follows Hesiod's concept of the four ages, takes the metals over into Latin, into a poem of transformations written for an audience that had never seen a Boeotian hillside, and gives the sequence a second life so durable that most people who know the Golden Age know it from him rather than from the farmer who first wrote it down. The third of the great works and days. Stories is Prometheus, and Ian Morris places his adventures precisely, a place between the history of the gods and that of man. Not quite either. The quarrels of the immortals are behind him, and the labors of mortals are in front of him, and he stands in the doorway between the two, handing something through it, which is the natural point at which to leave the metals and enter the age that doorway opens onto. There was a stretch of the world's imagined past when the two households were not kept apart. It bridges the time when the gods lived among themselves and the later time when divine interference in human affairs had grown limited and occasional. The early days when the groups mingled far more freely than they ever did afterward. A god on a road, a goddess at a door. Not an epiphany, not a portent, an encounter of the kind that could happen to a herdsman on an ordinary afternoon. Most of these tales come down to us told by Ovid in that same book of transformations, and they are usually sorted into two heaps, tales of love and tales of punishment. The tales of love are difficult, and there is no honest way to make them comfortable. They often involve incest, or the seduction or rape of a mortal woman by a male god, and the outcome, in the logic of the cycle, is heroic offspring. The great names of the next age are produced this way, but the stories themselves are not admiring. Taken together, they suggest, quite consistently, that relationships between gods and mortals are something to avoid. Even the consenting ones rarely end happily. Somebody is transformed, or exiled, or destroyed by a jealous third party, or simply left behind to age while the other does not. Whatever the poets thought they were celebrating, what they actually recorded over and over is that the distance between the two kinds of being is not survivable at close range. The reverse case is rarer, and one instance is preserved with unusual care. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty lies with a mortal man, Anchises, and the child of that union is Aeneas, a name that will matter enormously later, in another language, in another city's account of itself. A female divinity choosing a mortal man is uncommon enough in the material that the hymn treats it as an event requiring explanation. The tales of punishment run on a different engine, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. They typically involve the appropriation or the invention of some important cultural artifact. Something crosses from the divine side to the human side, or something that ought not to exist comes into existence. And the story is about what it costs. Prometheus steals fire from the gods. Tantalus steals nectar and ambrosia from the table of Zeus and gives it to his subjects, revealing to them the secrets of the gods, not merely a theft of food, but a leak, an unauthorized distribution of what was meant to stay upstairs. Sacrifice itself has an inventor, and the tradition cannot decide who it was. Prometheus in one account, Lycaon in another. Demeter teaches agriculture and the mysteries with it to Triptolemus, and Marsyas invents the aulos, the reed pipe, the instrument of processions and of drinking parties, and, having invented it, enters into a musical contest with Apollo, which is the last decision he ever makes. Line those up and a pattern shows through: fire, food, sacrifice, farming and the rites that go with it, music, everything that separates a settled human life from bare survival is in that list, and in every case the tale attaches a penalty to its arrival. It is not a claim that these things are wrong, it's an accounting. The tradition insists that nothing which raised human life above the ground came free, and that the invoice, in each case, was presented to an individual by name. Two stories of that arrival are worth telling at length, because they show the two directions the exchange can fail: the mortal who refuses the god, and the mortal who accepts and mishandles. An anonymous papyrus fragment, dated to the 3rd century, portrays the punishment of Lycurgus, king of Thrace, by Dionysus. The offense is not blasphemy exactly, and not violence exactly. It is timing. The king's recognition of the new god came too late. Dionysus arrives in his country as an unknown power, and the king does not receive him as one. And by the time the king understands what has come into his land, the moment for receiving it has passed. The penalties described in the fragment are severe, and this is the detail that gives the story its cold weight. They extend into the afterlife. The account does not stop at the man's death. Whatever was done to him goes on being done in the unseen place. That arrival was a subject the Greek stage returned to. The coming of Dionysus to establish his cult in Thrace was the matter of a whole trilogy by Aeschylus. And the most famous version of the pattern is Euripides' The Bacchae, where the setting is Thebes and the king is Pentheus. His fault is spelled out plainly. He disrespected the god, and he spied on the Maenads, the female worshippers, going out to watch what he had no standing to watch. A king who will not admit the god, and then cannot stay away from him, the two halves of the same refusal. Something in that story clearly troubled the Greeks more than most, because they told it again and again. A new power arrives at the edge of a settled kingdom. It asks to be let in. the man in charge, whose whole function is to decide what enters his city, decides wrongly, and the deciding is what destroys him. Now the gentler case, and the stranger one, because nobody in it means any harm at all. Demeter was searching for her daughter Persephone. She was going through the world in the shape of an old woman, and she had given herself a name for the journey, Doso. Nothing about her announced what she was. She came to Eleusis, in Attica, and there she received a hospitable welcome from Celeus, the king of that place. The ordinary welcome owed to an elderly stranger at a door, which in the Greek world was not a courtesy, but an obligation, and one the gods were understood to watch. He took her in, he asked nothing, and she resolved to repay him in the only currency she actually had. Celeus had an infant son, Demophon, and Demeter planned to make the boy a god. That was the gift, not treasure, not a good harvest for the estate, but the removal of death from a child of the house. There was a ritual for it, and it required fire, and she began. Then his mother walked in. Metanira came into the room and saw her son in the fire. She had no way of knowing what she was looking at. She saw an old woman she had taken in, out of kindness, holding her baby in the flames, and she screamed in fright, which is what any mother in any century would have done. The scream broke the working. The goddess was unable to complete the ritual, and the boy stayed mortal, and the gift that could not be given a second time was not given. And Demeter was angry, not at the fear, at the ignorance behind it. The lament recorded of her is that foolish mortals do not understand the concept and the ritual, which is exactly true and exactly the trouble. Metanira did not understand what was in front of her because there was no possible way for her to understand it, and the goddess had not explained, because gods in these stories do not explain. Two beings who wished each other nothing but good stood in one room and ruined an immortality between them. There is no villain in that story, and I think it is the saddest thing in this whole part of the tradition. The one absolutely well-meant transaction between the two households fails, and it fails on a scream. That closes the mingling age. What follows is the age the Greeks themselves cared about most, and it arrives with a structure rather than with a single tale. The heroes did not appear as a crowd of unrelated adventurers. Epic and genealogical poetry did something organizational with them. It created cycles of stories clustered around particular heroes or particular events, and, the crucial part, it established the family relationships between the heroes of different stories, which arranged the whole mass into a sequence. This man's grandfather sailed with that man's father. This queen is that king's cousin. Once those links are in place, separate tales stop being separate. They become episodes. Ken Dowden gives the result a name that catches it precisely. There is even a saga effect, in which we can follow the fates of some families in successive generations. Not one hero and his adventure, but a house, over time, the founding, the crime, the inheritance, the reckoning 3 generations on. The Greeks built themselves a literature that could hold a family across 100 years, and they built it out of poems that were composed separately and never intended to fit. The heroes also acquired standing in practice, not only in poetry. After the rise of the hero cult, gods and heroes together constitute the sacral sphere, and they are invoked together in oaths and in prayers. When a man swore, he might name both. But there is one difference between the two cults that governs everything else about them. The hero becomes the center of local group identity. A god belongs to everyone. Heracles is honored in 100 places. A hero, in the usual case, belongs here, to this town, this valley, these families, whose claim on him is precisely that he is theirs and not the neighbor's. Worship of a hero is a statement about who you are and where you are from. And unlike the gods, the roster was never closed. Walter Burkert states it in a sentence that should be sat with: the roster of heroes, again in contrast to the gods, is never given fixed and final form. Great gods are no longer born, but new heroes can always be raised up from the army of the dead. The sky was finished. Its households were settled, its seats allotted, its succession permanently concluded. The ground was not finished. Underneath every Greek community lay an inexhaustible supply of the dead, and out of it a new hero could always be brought forward. A founder, a fallen champion, a name that a city decided to begin honoring. The tradition kept one door open, and it was the lower one. To this age, the Greeks ascribed 3 great events, and the 3 sit like pillars under everything that came after: the Argonautic expedition, the Theban cycle, and the Trojan War. Each generated its own cluster of stories, its own genealogies, its own crop of local legends, attaching themselves as the cycle traveled. And the dawn of the whole age, the monumental events with which it was understood to begin, belonged to one man. His name, Heracles, means the glory of Hera, or the fame of Hera. The Greek carries both. Sit with that a moment, because it is one of the odder facts in the tradition. The greatest of the Greek heroes goes through his entire career carrying the name of the goddess who is his most implacable enemy. It was not his first name either. He was born Alcaeus, Alcides in the other form, and the name of glory came afterward. His parentage is doubled in the way that heroic parentage tends to be. He was the son of Zeus and of Alcmene, and the foster son of Amphitryon, who raised him. He was also a descendant of Perseus, another son of Zeus. In the traditional reckoning, Alcmene was Perseus's granddaughter, which folds the line back on itself and makes him twice descended from the same god by 2 different roots. Genealogy of that density is not accident. It is a family claiming everything it can. What he became was the greatest of the Greek heroes, the ancestor of royal clans known as the Heracleidae, and a champion of the Olympian order against chthonic monsters. The man sent, over and over, against the things that come up out of the ground. His exploits are fantastic, and notably solitary. He does not command an army. He goes alone, and the tales are thick with folk-tale themes, the sort of motifs that turn up in stories told anywhere. The impossible task, the monstrous opponent, the trick that succeeds where strength cannot. That texture is exactly why he furnished so much material for popular legend. His stories were not court poetry. They were the kind people repeat. The most famous of them are the 12 labors, famous out of all proportion to what actually survives about them, as you have already heard, since the written record of the individual 12 is far thinner than their fame suggests. What is not thin is the picture of him. In art and in literature, Heracles is represented as an enormously strong man of moderate height, not a giant, not a towering figure who dwarfs the people around him, a normal-sized man built like nothing else, which is far more unsettling than size would be. His characteristic weapon is the bow, though frequently he carries the club as well, and the club is what most people picture first. And one image recurs beyond all the others, his fight with the lion, painted on vases many hundreds of times, the two bodies locked together, the man's arms around the animal's neck. That motif did not begin in Greece. His figure initially drew on Near Eastern models, the lion fight among them, which had been in circulation long before anyone in Greece drew it on a pot. He is also, in the record of cult, a man of the altar. Burkert describes him as portrayed as a sacrificer, mentioned as a founder of altars, and imagined as a voracious eater himself, and it is in that last role that he walks onto the comic stage. The greatest hero of the Greeks was also their reliable joke about appetite. The enormous guest, the man who empties the table, the figure whose arrival at a house is funny before it is anything else. That is not disrespect. A culture only makes comedy out of what it is entirely sure of. Later hands raised him again. The Alexandrian poets of the Hellenistic age drew his mythology into a high poetic and tragic atmosphere, taking the folk-tale strongman and the comic glutton and finding in the same life something grave. They had material for it. His end was tragic, and that end provided a great deal for the tragedians to work with. A career of impossible victories closing in a way that none of the victories could prevent, which leaves an oddity standing in the middle of the tradition, unresolved and never tidied away. What exactly he was when the sacrifices were made? He was, in the plainest terms the tradition allows, both. Pindar puts two words together that ought not to sit together. Heros theos. Hero god, and the phrase is not a poet's flourish, it describes a practice. At the same festival, on the same day, sacrifice was made to Heracles first as a hero, with a chthonic libation, and then as a god, upon an altar. The worshippers poured downward into the ground for the dead champion. Then they turned and gave him the upward offering, the one made on stone in the open air, for the immortal, the same crowd, the same afternoon, the same name spoken twice, in 2 grammars. Nothing else in Greek practice quite does this. The distinction between the two modes was the clearest line the tradition drew. You have already heard how a stranger could read a sanctuary by watching which way the hands moved, and here that line runs straight through a single figure and does not break him. He is the closest the Greeks ever came to what a later vocabulary would call a demigod, and they arrived at it not by arguing, but by doing both things and declining to choose. Several cities went further and built the contradiction into their streets. In a number of polis there were two separate sanctuaries for him, one that recognized him as a god, and another that recognized him only as a hero. Two precincts, two sets of rites, two doorways, in the same town, for the same man. A citizen would have known which one to go to, depending on what he was asking for. The way you know which of two rooms in a house is the right one for a particular conversation. He was the greatest of the Hellenic chthonic heroes, and unlike every other Greek hero, no tomb anywhere was identified as his. That absence is the strangest fact in his whole dossier, and it undoes the ordinary logic of hero cult from the inside. A hero belongs to a place because his bones are in it. The grave is the anchor. The local claim rests on the body. Towns quarreled over such bones and moved them ceremonially from one territory to another, and the greatest of them all had no grave at all. Honored with chthonic libations, given the offerings owed to a powerful dead man in 100 places, none of which could point to the ground he was under. His ambiguity is what created the cult, rather than what troubled it, and historians and artists both encouraged the worship as it spread. Herodotus took an interest, and painters in the time of the Pisistratids put him everywhere. The trouble surfaced in a poem, in the 11th book of the Odyssey. The passage the Greeks called the Nequia. Odysseus meets the dead, and among them he meets Heracles, which was fine once. It became an awkwardness the moment the hero's role as a culture hero, whose death could be told as a story, was resolved by his acceptance into the Olympian pantheon in classical times. He is on the mountain with Hebe, and he is also in the dark, being described by a man who says he saw him there. Friedrich Solmsen states the problem exactly. Once people knew of Heracles' admission to Olympus, they would not tolerate his presence in the underworld, so the text acquired a repair. An aside was inserted, dividing him. The shade below is not the man above, only his phantom, and the interpolated verses represent a compromise between conflicting representations of the hero. Ancient critics already saw the seam. They noticed that the aside interrupts a description otherwise vivid and complete. Some modern critics deny that the verse's opening, in Fagles' rendering, his ghost, belonged to the original composition at all. 3 words, dropped into a poem centuries old, to keep one figure from standing in 2 places at once. Away from the manuscripts, his traces are physical and scattered. The Greeks kept a festival called the Heraclea, and what it commemorated was his death, not a victory, not a labor, his death. held on the second day of the month of Metageitnion, which falls in late July or the beginning of August. High summer, the hottest and driest stretch of the year, when the ground is hard and the harvest is in. There is a very small island near Lemnos called Neai, and the name comes from the verb neo, meaning I dive or I swim. It was called that because Heracles swam there. No temple explains it, no story of a monster attaches to it. Somebody, at some point, looked at a rock in the water and gave it a name that means the act of swimming, because that was what had happened there. Far south of any of this, in the Baharia oasis in Egypt, stands a structure believed to be a temple of Heracles, dating to 21 BCE, Greek worship of a Greek hero, out among the palms and the salt, a very long way from the Peloponnese. And ancient cities carried his name in plain form. Several were called Heraclea, scattered across the map, wherever Greeks settled and wanted a founder. What stood behind all of it, nobody knows, and the guesses are worth hearing, precisely because they disagree so completely. Some scholars believe that behind the complicated mythology there was probably a real man, a chieftain vassal of the kingdom of Argos, whose accomplishments were exaggerated over generations until they became impossible. Others suggest the whole career is an allegory, the sun's yearly passage through the 12 constellations, the labors being months, the hero being the year. Others again point to earlier myths from other cultures and read him as a local adaptation of hero stories already well established elsewhere. Walter Burkert reaches back further still, finding the core of the story in Neolithic hunter culture and in traditions of shamanistic crossing into the netherworld, which would make the descent for the hound the oldest thing about him rather than the strangest. A soldier, a solar year, a borrowed pattern, or a hunter's trance. 4 answers, and the material supports all 4 badly, and none of them decisively. What is not in doubt is what he became useful for once he was dead, because the uses were political, and they were enormous. He attained the highest social prestige available to a figure of that kind through his appointment as official ancestor of the Dorian kings. Appointment is the correct word. Someone made the decision, and the decision did work. It probably served as a legitimation for the Dorian migrations into the Peloponnese, a movement of peoples that needed, as such movements always need, a story explaining why the land in question was not being taken but reclaimed. The mechanism ran through a family. Hylas, the eponymous hero of one Dorian phyla, one of the tribal divisions by which a Dorian community organized itself, became a son of Heracles, and so one of the Heracleidae. The others named in that company are Macaria, Lamos, Manto, Bianor, Tlepolemus, and Telephus, and the descendants of Hylas in particular carried the line forward. These Heraclids conquered the Peloponnesian kingdoms, Mycenae, Sparta, Argos, and the claim they made, according to the legend, was not the claim of a conqueror, it was the claim of an heir. The right to rule those cities came to them through their ancestor. Their rise to dominance is frequently called the Dorian invasion, and the invaders arrived carrying a genealogy the way another army would carry a siege engine. The device, once built, was portable. The Lydian kings, and later the Macedonian kings, as rulers of the same rank, also became Heraclidi, not by conquest, by classification. If you held a throne of that standing, the line ran to you as well. He crossed the sea too, and changed his sound. Heracles entered Etruscan, and then Roman mythology and cult, and his name became an ordinary noise in the Roman mouth. The exclamation, "Me Hercule," was as familiar to Romans as Heracleus had been to Greeks. Not a prayer, the thing you say when you drop something, the oath that has stopped meaning what it means. In Italy, he was worshipped as a god of merchants and traders, which is a striking reassignment for a strangler of lions. Men with cargo and ledgers found in him a patron. Others prayed to him for what had always been his characteristic gifts, good luck, or rescue from danger. The details of his cult were adapted to Rome along with the name, and in Rome and the modern West, he is Hercules. Emperors noticed. Later Roman rulers identified themselves with him, Commodus and Maximian in particular, putting on the hero's attributes in an attempt to borrow his standing. And according to the Greek legends, one Italian town owed him its very existence. Herculaneum was said to have been founded by him, a city on the Bay of Naples, bearing the name of a man from a Greek song and believing itself begun by his hands. Let the mind go slack a little here, if it is ready. The rest of this is quieter, a set of names and the shapes of stories, more than stories themselves. Because he was not alone in that earliest generation, and his companions there share his texture. Perseus, Deucalion, Theseus, Bellerophon. The tradition groups them with him, and they have many traits in common with him. Their exploits are solitary, fantastic, and border on fairy tale. One man, one road, one impossible opponent. They slay monsters, the Chimera, the Medusa. Bellerophon's adventures in particular are commonplace types, similar in kind to the adventures of Heracles and of Theseus, which is not a criticism of Bellerophon. It's a description of how such stories work. The same shapes recur, attached to different names, in different valleys, and each valley believes its own version to be the original. One shape recurs more insistently than the rest, and it has a coldness to it that the surface of the tale usually hides. Sending a hero to his presumed death is a recurrent theme of this early tradition, and it is used in the case of Perseus and in the case of Bellerophon alike. Someone in authority, a king, a host, a man who cannot simply order a killing, gives the young man an errand that no one is expected to come back from. The task is dressed as an honor. The young man accepts it because refusing would be worse. And the story that follows is technically a monster story, but the monster is the second problem. The first problem is the person who sent him. Beyond that, the surviving evidence gives these figures largely an outline. A name, a monster, a shape of story, and in some cases, a single object. What the fuller narratives contained, how Deucalion's tale ran, what Bellerophon said to the man who sent him, cannot be supplied from what has come down, and supplying it would mean inventing it. So the outline is what there is, and there is a kind of accuracy in leaving it as outline. This is genuinely how much of the heroic past reached the Greeks themselves, in lists and allusions, with the fullness assumed rather than written. For one great expedition of that age, though, a whole poem survives, the only one of its kind left standing. The Argonautica was written by Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century before our era, an epic poet, a scholar, and the director of the Library of Alexandria, which means the man who composed it had, in a literal sense, more of Greek literature within reach than anybody before or since. It is the only surviving Hellenistic epic. Everything else of that scale and that era is gone, and this one voyage came through. It tells of Jason and the Argonauts, and of their sailing to retrieve the Golden Fleece from the mythical land of Colchis, at the far end of the sea. And the whole enormous undertaking is set in motion by a piece of footwear. King Peleus receives a prophecy. It does not name anyone. It says only that a man with one sandal would be his nemesis, which is the most useless and the most tormenting form a warning can take, because it makes every arriving stranger a candidate and gives the king nothing to act on until it is already happening. Jason, coming to the city, loses a sandal in a river. Not a symbolic loss, not a divine theft. A river crossing, a bad footing, and a sandal gone in the current. He walks on to the court of Pelias with one foot bare, and the king looks down. Everything after that, the ship, the crew, the sea, the fleece, proceeds from a man who has just seen his own prophecy walk through the door. He cannot kill the young man outright, so he gives him an errand instead, at the other end of the world, and the errand is the epic. The crew is where the age assembles itself. Nearly every member of the next generation of heroes went with Jason in the ship Argo, and Heracles went too, so the two generations overlap on one deck. That next generation included Theseus, who went to Crete to slay the Minotaur, Atalanta, the female heroine, whose presence among them the tradition names without apology, and Meleager, who once had an epic cycle of his own, a body of poetry substantial enough to rival the Iliad and the Odyssey, and which is now almost entirely lost, an entire rival epic tradition reduced to a name in a crew list. Who exactly sailed was a question that mattered, because families claimed descent from the crew. Pindar attempted a full roster, Apollonius attempted one. The Library attempted one. 3 careful sources, each endeavoring to give the complete list of the Argonauts, which tells you both that the answer was wanted and that it was never settled. The poem is late, the story is not. The composition of the tale of the Argonauts is earlier than the Odyssey and the Odyssey shows familiarity with the exploits of Jason, the way one poem knows another that its audience already has by heart. So the voyage that survives in a 3rd century text was old when the wandering of Odysseus was new, and the wandering may in part have been founded upon it. In ancient times, nobody filed this under fable. The expedition was regarded as historical fact, an incident in the opening up of the Black Sea to Greek commerce and colonization. Merchants and settlers going east and north into waters that had to be learned, and behind them a first ship whose captain had gone that way before anyone. The story was also enormously popular, and it did what popular stories do. It formed a cycle, and local legends attached themselves to it wherever it passed, each coastline finding a reason to have been on the route. And of all its threads, one caught more strongly than the voyage itself. The story of Medea seized the imagination of the tragic poets, and it was on the stage, not on the water, that she took the form in which the world has kept her. Between the return of the Argo and the walls near the Dardanelles, there lies a generation known chiefly for its horrific crimes, and the Greeks did not soften that description. 2 dynasties carry it. The house of Atreus and the house of Labdacus are the 2 principal heroic dynasties of the tradition, and behind the myths of both lies a single unresolved question: the devolution of power and the mode of accession to sovereignty. How does rule pass? By blood, by seniority, by strength, by the assembly's consent, by a sign from the gods? The stories are dreadful because the question had no fixed answer, and every unfixed answer in a royal house is settled eventually by somebody doing something unforgivable. The twins Atreus and Thyestes, with their descendants, played the leading role in the tragedy of the devolution of power in Mycenae, and their doings are set at Argos. Twins, which sharpens the problem to its finest point, since seniority, the ordinary tiebreaker, barely exists between them. What they did to each other, the sources here give only as horrific crimes, and the detail is not something to be supplied out of imagination. The tragedians who dramatized the house are the ones who filled that in, and their versions are their own. The other house belongs to Thebes. The Theban cycle deals with events associated especially with Cadmus, the city's founder, and then, generations later, with the doings of Laius and of Oedipus in the same city. It is a series of stories that leads to the War of the Seven against Thebes, and after that, to the eventual pillage of the city at the hands of the Epigoni, the sons of the Seven, coming back to finish what their fathers began: a siege, then a second siege by the children of the first. The saga effect, working exactly as described, across a wall that would not fall the first time. And the variants deserve care here, because one of these stories has been flattened by its own fame. The tale of Oedipus that everyone knows comes through tragedy, and through the later mythological handbooks. The early epic accounts appear to have run otherwise. In them, Oedipus seems to continue ruling at Thebes after the revelation that Iocaste was his mother. He does not vanish, he does not go into exile at the moment of discovery, and he subsequently marries a second wife, who becomes the mother of his children. Markedly different, and it changes the whole weight of the thing. Not a man destroyed by a single unbearable recognition, but a king who learns something terrible about his own house and goes on governing. Even the great siege has an uncertain footing. It is not known whether the seven figured in early epic at all. The war that gave Thebes its cycle may be older than anything we can see, or it may have taken its shape later, in poems now gone. Out of that same country of lost poems comes the last and the greatest of the heroic legends, and the one the whole tradition bends toward. The Trojan War is placed, in the sources, around the 13th or the early 12th century before our era, a legendary conflict waged by the Achaeans, the Greeks, against the city of Troy, which the ancient Greeks believed lay near the Dardanelles, on the far side of the water from their own coast. Everything in the heroic age drains into it. The families arranged by the genealogists, the crews listed by the poets, the houses ruined by their own successions, they all have someone at that wall. And the beginning of it is small. It is an apple. The cycle opens with Eris, whose name is strife, and a golden apple marked with a single word. Callisti. For the fairest. Not a weapon, not an army, not a grievance between kingdoms, an object with an inscription on it and no name attached, tossed among the Immortals, where it does exactly what such an object must do. It makes 3 claims where there is room for 1. The tradition does not need to explain the quarrel that follows. It simply sets the apple down and lets the reader understand that a prize awarded to the fairest cannot be awarded at all without insult. The decision is passed to a mortal, and the judgment of Paris is that decision. A young man of Troy is made to choose among goddesses, which is a task with no safe outcome. 2 of the 3 will remember it. What the choice cost is not stated in a sentence anywhere. It is stated across 10 years of poetry. The alignments you will find later, when the gods take sides in front of the walls, are the shape that judgment left behind. Then the abduction. Paris of Troy took Helen from her husband Menelaus, king of Sparta, and carried her across the sea to his father's city. In the ancient reckoning, this is not primarily a love story. It is the violation of a household by a guest, the failure of the oldest obligation the Greek world recognized, the one owed between a host and the man he takes in. A whole civilization's most dangerous idea is compressed into that crossing. What a king does when someone has taken something from inside his own walls. What he did was ask for her back, and the Trojans refused to return Helen. That refusal is the hinge on which the war turns, and it is recorded plainly, without elaboration. A demand was made, it was declined, and so the recovery of one woman became an expedition of a scale the tradition never assigns to anything else. Before the ships could sail, there was Aulis, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia, a daughter of the commander, given up at the gathering place of the fleet. The cycle sets it there, in its order, between the abduction and the sailing, and the fact that the war is prefaced by the killing of a girl belonging to the man in charge is not a detail the Greeks ever let go of. The tragedians would return to it again and again. Whatever the fleet was afterward, it left the shore already carrying a debt inside its own command. Then the launch. To recover Helen, the Greeks assembled a great expedition under the overall command of Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, king of Argos, or of Mycenae, depending on which source names his seat. Brother acting for brother, kingdom after kingdom bound in, the ships drawn up along a coast and then gone. 10 years lay ahead of them, and none of them knew it, and the poems that tell it were composed by men who did. Here something has to be said about how any of this reaches us, because the shape of the evidence is genuinely strange, and everything that follows depends on it. There is no single authoritative text which tells the entire events of the war. None. Not one poem, not one chronicle, not one book that runs from the apple to the last homecoming. The story is assembled from a variety of sources, and some of them report contradictory versions of the events. What feels, from a distance, like one long inherited narrative is in fact a reconstruction, a thing made by putting many partial accounts side by side and letting them overlap where they will. The two Homeric epics are the most important of those sources, and each of them narrates only a part. Around them stands the epic cycle, also called the cyclic epics, and its members have names that sound like the chapters of a book that no longer exists. The Cypria, the Ethiopis, the Little Iliad, the Iliopersis, the Nostoi, the Telegony. Between them they covered the beginning, the middle, and the aftermath, everything the two great poems left out. They survive only in fragments. What is known of their contents comes largely from a summary preserved in the Chrestomathy of Proclus, an outline, a table of what happened in each, written by someone who still had the poems in front of him. Read that carefully, and you see the position we are actually in. For much of the most famous war in Western memory, the primary source is a synopsis of poems nobody has read for centuries. Their authorship is uncertain. It is generally thought they were written down in the 7th and the 6th centuries before our era, after the composition of the Homeric poems, though it is widely believed they were based on earlier traditions, older material set into writing later, which is why a poem fixed after the Iliad can contain episodes that are plainly ancient. Both the Homeric epics and the cycle came out of oral tradition to begin with, and even after they were composed, the Trojan material went on being passed along orally in many genres of poetry. And far downstream, in another language, there are two more oddities, a pair of pseudo-chronicles written in Latin, passing under the names of Dictis Cretensis and Dares Phrygius. Chronicles rather than poems, purporting to be eyewitness reports from the war itself. They are not that, but they were believed, and they were read, and much later they became the version of Troy that Europe knew. Against all that fragmentation, One poem stands whole, and it is worth knowing exactly how narrow its window is. The Iliad opens in the 10th year, not at the sailing, not at the first landing, not at the 9th summer of a siege, in the last year, with the army long since dug in and everyone tired of everything. Its core, running from the 2nd book to the 23rd, covers 4 days and 2 nights. That is the span. A war of a decade, and the poem that carries its whole fame spends its length on 4 days. What happens in them is a quarrel. Agamemnon, holding the overall command, and Achilles, the finest warrior the Greeks have, fall out with one another. And the poem is about the consequences of that falling out, rather than about the war it interrupts. From the quarrel follow the deaths in battle of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved comrade, and of Hector, the eldest son of Priam. 2 men die because 2 other men could not settle a dispute over honor, and the poem tracks the line between the cause and the effect without ever letting either end out of sight. The epics depict man's struggle. That is the phrase the tradition earns. Not the struggle against an enemy city particularly. The struggle of being a person in a world where the outcome is not yours to set. They are not unrelieved, though, and this is regularly forgotten by people who have only heard about them. Despite the predominantly tragic and serious themes, the Homeric poems contain instances of comedy and of laughter. There are moments in them of ordinary human absurdity and moments where the immortals themselves are ridiculous and the poems are entirely comfortable with both. A tradition that could make a stage joke out of its greatest hero's appetite was never going to sing 4 days of grief without letting anyone smile. Above the fighting, there is the other war, and it is fought by relatives. The gods take sides. Aphrodite, Ares, and Apollo support the Trojans. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon support the Greeks. They oppose one another and try to outdo one another, intervening, shielding, misleading, snatching a favorite out of danger at the last moment and putting him down somewhere safe. And it changes nothing that matters. Above all of them stands what cannot be argued with, and the divine partisanship runs entirely inside a fate none of them can overturn. They can lengthen a thing, they can make it harder or slower or more painful. What is appointed still arrives. There is a strange comfort in that arrangement if you look at it from a bed in the dark. Even the powers with the weather in their hands are working inside limits, and even they are, in the end, attending an outcome rather than choosing one. Now the poem ends, and the war does not, and the boundary there deserves marking plainly, because almost everyone who knows the story of Troy knows it from material they. Iliad. Never contained. The famous horse is not in the Iliad. Neither is the death of Achilles, nor the sack, nor the 2 allies who come after Hector's funeral. All of that belongs to the epic cycle and to later work, which is precisely why so much of it survives only in outline. After Hector's death, the Trojans were joined by 2 exotic allies, the source's own phrase, and both of them come from outside the ordinary map of the war. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, arrived with her women. Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, arrived as the son of Eos, the dawn goddess, which puts a child of the morning on the losing side of a story about a city that burns at night. Both fought. Achilles killed both of them. And then Paris, the young man from the beginning of all of it, the one who was handed the apple, managed to kill Achilles with an arrow in the heel. That heel was the only part of his body not invulnerable to damage by human weaponry, the single place where the ordinary rules still applied to him. The finest warrior in the Greek army was brought down by the smallest available target, struck by the man whose choice had opened the war. The tradition rarely closes a circle that neatly. The city still stood, and before the Greeks could take it, they had to steal from the citadel the wooden image of Pallas Athena, the Palladium, an old carved figure kept inside the walls, whose presence was understood to hold the place. Troy had to be emptied of its protection before it could be emptied of anything else. So the first act of the taking is a theft, done quietly, of an object. Then, with Athena's help, they built the horse. Consider what the trick actually required, because it was not primarily a feat of carpentry. It required the Trojans to bring the thing in themselves. Sinon, a Greek who feigned desertion, persuaded them, a man who let himself be captured and told a story to the people who found him. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, warned against it, and her warnings did not hold. The priest Laocoon tried to have the horse destroyed and was killed by sea serpents, which is the only moment in the sequence when something clearly more than human intervenes in plain view. The city debated and decided and opened its own gate and took the horse inside as an offering to Athena, a gift to the goddess who was helping the men inside it. At night the Greek fleet returned. It had gone, visibly, over the horizon, and the withdrawal was the other half of the deception. In the dark it came back, and the men within the horse came out and opened the gates of Troy from the inside. The sack that followed was total, and the sources record it without softening. Priam and his remaining sons were killed. The Trojan women passed into slavery in various cities of Greece, carried off as property, distributed, dispersed among the households of the victors, and that dispersal is the true end of Troy, far more than the fire is. A city is not extinguished by the burning of its roofs. It is extinguished when its surviving families are broken up and given away. The Greeks did not hide from this. They carved it. The metopes of the Parthenon, the sculpted panels running around the great temple above the city of Athens, include the sack of Troy among their subjects. Of all the possible scenes a people might set on the outside of its most important building, they chose in part the night a city was destroyed by their ancestors. The Trojan cycle furnished a main source of inspiration for ancient Greek artists, and that preference in the artwork is itself the evidence of how much the cycle mattered to them. If sleep is close now, there is no need to keep hold of the sequence. What follows is the long unwinding, men going home or failing to. because the war does not end at the wall. The adventurous homeward voyages of the Greek leaders formed a body of story in their own right, and they were told in two epics, the Returns, the Nostoi, which is lost, and the Odyssey, which is not the Odyssey, concerns one man's return to his home island of Ithaca after the sack, and it works by looking backward as much as forward. It contains several flashbacks to particular episodes of the war, so that the fighting reaches us obliquely, remembered by men who were there and are now somewhere else. A story told at a table years later, in a hall belonging to strangers. And the wandering itself may not be original to him. The composition of the Argonaut material is older, and Odysseus's voyage may have been partly founded on that earlier tale of a ship going out past the known coasts and coming back. A sea journey pattern reused with a different man aboard and a different reason for going. Not everyone reached a hall. Agamemnon, who had held the overall command, who had assembled the kings and sailed from Aulis and taken the city, came home and was murdered. 10 years of war survived. His own house not survived. The tradition put those two facts next to each other on purpose, and the house of Atreus, whose troubles were old before the fleet ever sailed, closed around him. One survivor went the other way entirely. Aeneas, a Trojan, on the losing side, son of the goddess who lay with Anchises, left the burning city, and his journey from Troy led to the founding of the city that would one day become Rome. That is the account given in Virgil's Aeneid. And the second book of that poem contains the best-known description of the sack of Troy anywhere, the fullest telling of a Greek victory written centuries later in Latin from the point of view of the defeated. The story of Troy was preserved most vividly by the people who claimed descent from the losers. And the cycle goes on into the next generation. It follows the children of the Trojan generation, Orestes, the son of the murdered commander, and Telemachus, the son of the wanderer. One inherits a killing to answer. The other inherits an absence. Both of them are boys who grew up inside a war they were too young to attend, and the tradition, having spent 10 years on the fathers, turns and asks what such a war leaves in a household. Most of what the world now remembers of these families, it remembers from the theatre. Myth was central to classical Athenian drama, and the tragic playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, took most of their plots from the myths of the Age of Heroes and of the Trojan War. The great tragic stories took their classic form there. Agamemnon and his children, Oedipus, Jason, Medea, not on a ship or a battlefield, but on a wooden stage in front of a seated city in a competition generations after the epics. The versions that feel most inevitable are frequently the newest ones, which leaves the question that has followed the whole of it, and there is a mound in modern Turkey where the question gets its most concrete answer. By the middle of the 19th century of our era, both the war and the city were widely regarded as non-historical, not doubted at the edges, dismissed. Troy was a place in a poem, the way a country in a fable is a place in a fable, and educated opinion had settled the matter. Then, in 1868, the German amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann met Frank Calvert, and Calvert convinced him that Troy stood at what is now called Hisarlık, on the basis of excavations conducted by Schliemann and by others after him. That identification is now accepted by most scholars. There is a hill, and under the hill there are cities stacked on cities, each built on the flattened remains of the last. One of those layers burned. Archaeological evidence of a catastrophic burning of Troy 7 corresponds roughly to the dates that Eratosthenes gave for the war in antiquity, 1194 to 1184 before our era, and to the wider Late Bronze Age collapse, the period in which a great many settlements across that world came to violent or sudden ends. A destruction layer at approximately the right place, at approximately the right time. Schliemann's work also opened the Mycenaean civilization to view, and in the following century, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans uncovered the Minoan civilization on Crete. Together, those discoveries helped explain many existing questions about the Homeric epics, and supplied archaeological evidence for a great many of the mythological details concerning gods and heroes. Palaces of a scale the poems had described, objects of a kind the poems had named. And now the caution, which has to be given as squarely as the discovery. The historicity of the Trojan War remains an open question. Many scholars do hold that there is a historical core to the tale, but for a good number of them, that phrase means something considerably looser than a single siege. It may mean only that the Homeric stories are a fusion, various tales of sieges and expeditions carried out by Mycenaean Greeks during the Bronze Age, gathered over centuries around one remembered place and one remembered name. Those who do think a specific conflict stands behind it usually date it to the 12th or the 11th century before our era, and often prefer Eratosthenes dates, which is a curious thing in itself, a modern estimate leaning on an ancient one. So the literary and archaeological sources intersect, and the intersection is not always agreement. Sometimes each reinforces the other. Sometimes they present contradictions, a text saying one thing and a trench saying another. Despite the absence of complete consensus, the available evidence points to historical roots for Greek mythology. Roots, which is a carefully chosen word. It does not mean the apple or the horse or the arrow that found the heel. It means that underneath the songs there was a real coastline, real ships, real burned towns, and real people who remembered something and set it to meter. A trench can settle a hill. It cannot settle a poem, and by the time anyone dug at that mound, the poems had already stood trial once, in their own language, in front of judges who had grown up reciting them. The prosecution assembled slowly, and it assembled out of new habits of mind rather than out of hostility. In the late 5th century before our era, philosophy, history, prose, and rationalism rose together in the Greek world, and the role of myth grew less certain, almost by accident. The old way of accounting for a people had been genealogical. This city descends from that hero, who descends from that god, and the descent is the explanation. What replaced it was a conception of history that tried to exclude the supernatural altogether. The manner of writing associated with Thucydides, in which causes are human, motives are calculable, and no goddess turns aside a spear. Nobody announced the change. Writers simply began leaving something out, and the space it had occupied stayed empty. The philosophers had been less patient, and considerably earlier. Already in the 6th century, a few radical thinkers were calling the poets' tales blasphemous lies. Xenophanes of Colophon put the charge in the form that stuck. Homer and Hesiod attributed to the gods all that is shameful and disgraceful among men. They steal, commit adultery, and deceive one another. Read the objection carefully, and you see that it is not skepticism about whether gods exist. It is an argument about what a god would have to be. A being worth calling divine cannot behave like a bad neighbor. And since the poems were where the Greeks learned how the gods behaved, the poems were teaching something false about the highest thing there is. That line of thought found its widest expression in Plato, in the Republic, and in the Laws. He attacked the traditional tales of the gods' tricks, their thefts, their adulteries, as immoral, and he objected to their central place in literature, which in his world meant their central place in education. And he gave the whole tradition a dismissal so light that it has never stopped stinging. Old wives' chatter, not blasphemy, not heresy. Gossip, the kind of thing said at the back of a house by people with nothing better to discuss. His criticism was the first serious challenge the Homeric tradition ever faced, and it arrived with an alternative attached, which is what makes it so peculiar. Plato created allegorical myths of his own. The vision of closing the Republic is a journey to the place of the dead and back, told to make a point about the soul. The man who wanted the old stories out of the schoolroom wrote new ones for the same purpose. He objected to the form's authority and then borrowed its authority for himself. Aristotle came at the problem from a different angle, the angle of method. He criticized the quasi-mythical approach of the earlier philosophers, and his complaint is dry and rather devastating. Hesiod and the theological writers, he said, were concerned only with what seemed plausible to themselves and had no respect for us. It is not worth taking seriously writers who show off in the mythical style. As for those who do proceed by proving their assertions, we must cross-examine them. There is the whole quarrel in one sentence. A story asks to be received. An argument asks to be tested. You cannot cross-examine a theogony because it never offered you a premise to attack. And still the old material would not let go of the people attacking it. Even Plato did not manage to wean himself or his society from the influence of myth. His characterization of Socrates, The portrait by which the world knows the man is built on traditional Homeric and tragic patterns used by the philosopher to praise his teacher's righteous life. In the defense speech, when Socrates needs an image of a person who will not save himself at the cost of dishonor, he does not reach for an argument. He reaches for the son of Thetis. The goddess had told her child that if he avenged the death of his friend Patroclus and killed Hector, he himself would die. Straightway, after Hector, death was appointed unto him. And the young man made light of death and danger, fearing far more to live as a coward and not to avenge his friends. His answer is quoted directly: "Straightway may I die, after doing vengeance upon the wrongdoer, that I may not stay here, jeered at beside the curved ships, a burden of the earth." The philosopher who called the tales chatter proved his teacher's courage by putting him beside a hero from those same tales. The stage did something similar and more openly. Euripides, working in the 5th century, played with the old traditions and mocked them, injecting notes of doubt through the mouths of his characters. A servant, a messenger, a woman in ruin, pausing to wonder aloud whether the gods really do the things the stories say. His chief target was the gods themselves, and his objection resembles one voiced before him by Xenocrates. The divinities as traditionally represented are far too crassly anthropomorphic, too petty, too much like a bad family. Many of his plays were written in answer to a predecessor's version of the same myth, which means the audience was watching an argument between two poems as much as watching a story. And yet the subjects of his plays were taken, without exception, from myth. Every single one. The most doubting voice in Athenian theatre never once wrote about anything else. Outside the theatre and the lecture room, the change hardly registered. Hansen and Heath estimate that Plato's rejection of the Homeric tradition was not favorably received by the grassroots of Greek civilization, and it is easy to see why, since profound knowledge of the Homeric epos was deemed by the Greeks the very basis of their acculturation. To know the poems was to be a person of that world. A philosopher could demonstrate that the gods in them behaved badly. He could not thereby remove the material through which ordinary people had learned to speak, to swear an oath, to praise a dead man, to understand their own coastline. The old myths went on being kept alive in local cults. They went on shaping poetry. They remained the main subjects of painting and of sculpture, which is to say that the walls of the cities never accepted the verdict at all. What the criticism did change was how the educated handled the material, and the handling grew more ingenious with every century. In the Hellenistic period, mythology acquired a new social flavor. It took on the prestige of elite knowledge, marking whoever possessed it as belonging to a certain class. Knowing which local variant a poet was following, catching an allusion in a single epithet, this became a way of demonstrating what you were. And at the same moment, the skeptical turn of the classical age grew even more pronounced. Those two developments sound contradictory, and are not. The people best equipped to doubt the stories were exactly the people who had learned them most thoroughly. Out of that setting came a method that has never gone away. The mythographer, Euhemerus, established the tradition of seeking an actual historical basis for mythical beings and events, of reading the gods as kings and benefactors of long ago, remembered gratefully and then worshipped by mistake. His own work, the Sacred Scriptures, is lost. What is known of it comes from what Diodorus recorded and from Lactantius. So a way of reading that would be applied to every myth in Europe survives only as an outline in other men's books, which is the fate his own theory would predict for a legend. Under the Roman Empire, the rationalizing approaches multiplied, carried by the physicalist theories of Stoic and Epicurean philosophy. The Stoics explained the gods and heroes as physical phenomena, the sky god as the upper air, the smith as fire, the sea ruler as the sea, while the Euhemerists explained them as historical figures. Two solutions, opposite in direction, both dissolving the person into something else. At the same time, the Stoics and the Neoplatonists promoted the moral significations of the tradition, frequently building their readings on Greek etymologies, teasing a lesson out of a god's name, as though the name were a small sealed argument. Lucretius took a harder line and a kinder motive. Through his Epicurean message, he sought to expel superstitious fears from the minds of his fellow citizens, not to correct their poetry, but to relieve their dread, the ordinary nighttime dread of punishment after death. Livy, writing history, declined the whole question with a shrug of professional caution. He says plainly that he does not intend to pass judgment on such legends, on the fabulae that stand at the beginning of his own city's story. The most interesting position belonged to a scholar rather than a poet. Varro, the antiquarian, regarded the practices of his people as a human institution of great importance for the preservation of good in society, and he studied the origins of the cults with real rigor. His Antiquitates Rerum Divinarum has not survived. Its general approach is known through Augustine's City of God, which is to say through a Christian writer preserving a pagan scholar in order to argue with him. Varro drew a distinction that ought to be better known. Whereas the superstitious man fears the gods, the truly religious person venerates them as parents. Fear and veneration are not degrees of one attitude, they are different relationships. And he sorted the accounts of the gods into three. There is the mythical account, created by the poets for theatre and entertainment. There is the civil account, used by the people for veneration and by the city for its public life. And there is the natural account, created by the philosophers. Three descriptions of the same figures, serving three purposes, and none of them reducible to the others. The best state, Varro adds, is the one in which the civil theology combines the poetic mythical account with the philosophers, where the city's practice keeps both the beauty and the reasoning, and does not have to choose. Others refuse the compromise entirely. The academic Cotta ridicules both the literal acceptance of myth and the allegorical one, declaring roundly that myths have no place in philosophy. which closes the door on the Stoics and the Euhemerists in a single motion. Cicero is generally disdainful of the material too, and yet emphatic in support of the state's religious institutions, and his most comprehensive statement of the whole question stands in De Natura Deorum. He asserts there that nobody is so foolish as to believe in the terrors of the house of the dead, or in the existence of Scyllus and centaurs and other composite creatures, not even old women, not even boys. And elsewhere the same orator complains about the superstitious and credulous character of the people. Both remarks cannot be true at once, and their author does not appear to have noticed. It is difficult to know how far down the social scale that rationalism really extended. While the educated argued about what the gods meant, the gods themselves were quietly changing shape, because the tradition had crossed the sea and entered a city with different habits. A new Roman mythology was born through the syncretization of numerous Greek and other foreign gods. The reason given in the sources is blunt. The Romans had little mythology of their own, and inheriting the Greek tradition caused their major gods to adopt the characteristics of their Greek equivalents. Zeus and Jupiter are the standing example of that overlap. Not two names for one god, but two gods whose stories were fitted over one another until the seams stopped showing. What the Romans did with the material was distinctively their own. They usually treated their traditional narratives as historical, even where those narratives held miraculous elements, an event that happened in a place you could walk to, with a marvel in it. And their stories bend toward different subjects than the Greek ones. They are concerned with politics and with morality, with how a person's private integrity relates to their duty to the community. Where they illuminate practice, they are more concerned with ritual, with augury, with institutions, than with theology or cosmogony. A Greek poem asks how the world came to be. A Roman one asks who has the right to take the auspices before the assembly meets. Then the empire reached further east, and the blending accelerated. The cult of the sun was introduced at Rome after Aurelian's successful campaigns in Syria. The Asiatic divinities Mithras, that is to say the sun, and Baal were combined with Apollo and with Helios into a single figure, Sol Invictus, with conglomerated rites and compound attributes. Four traditions folded into one, and the rites folded with them, so that what was performed was a composite of what several peoples had separately performed. The worship of Sol as the special protector of the emperors and of the empire remained the chief imperial religion until it was replaced by Christianity. Something curious happened to the stories during all this. Apollo might be increasingly identified in practice with Helios, or even with Dionysus, and the texts retelling his myths seldom reflected the development at all. The poems went on saying what they had always said. The traditional literary mythology was becoming dissociated from the actual religious practice of the people reading it. Two versions of the same god, drifting apart. One in the hymn on the shelf, one at the altar down the street. Two late collections show the drift plainly. The Orphic hymns in the form that survives, belong to the 2nd century of our era, and the Saturnalia of Macrobius Ambrosius Theodosius to the 5th, both influenced by the rationalizing theories and by the syncretizing trends. Macrobius set out to transmit the Hellenic culture he had gathered from his reading, and much of his treatment of the gods is colored by Egyptian and North African material, which shapes his interpretation of Virgil as well. In his pages, the Euhemerists, the Stoics, and the Neoplatonists all reappear, arguing quietly inside a book written centuries after they died. Without a handful of collectors, very little of this would have reached anyone at all. The library that goes under the name of Pseudo-Apollodorus did its patient reconciling work. The historians Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus preserved a great deal in passing, and the geographers Pausanias and Strabo traveled throughout the Greek world, writing down the stories they heard on the spot, which is why they supply so many local myths and legends, often in versions known nowhere else. A traveler stops at a spring, asks whose it is, and writes the answer down. Herodotus in particular searched the traditions he encountered, looking for the historical or mythological roots in the confrontation between Greece and the East, and attempting to reconcile the origins and the blending of differing cultural ideas. Much of what survives because somebody was curious on a road. If you are still awake, let this next part carry you. It is only the fortunes of a word, moving slowly through languages that no longer worshipped anything in it. The Byzantine Greek writers and various others, Arnobius, Hesychius, whoever compiled the Suda, John Tzetzes, Eustathius, provide important details of myth, much of it derived from earlier Greek works now entirely lost. They preserved the material while treating it from a Christian moralizing perspective, copying out the loves of Zeus in order to disapprove of them and thereby saving them. The word itself crossed over in a book title. Mythologia was borrowed into late Latin, appearing in the title of Fabius Planciades Fulgentius's 5th century. Mythologiae, where it denoted what is now called classical mythology, the Greco-Roman stories about the gods. Fulgentius explicitly treated his subject matter as allegories requiring interpretation, and not as true events. From Latin, the term passed into Middle French as mythologie. English took up mythology. In the 15th century, meaning at first the exposition of a myth, the interpretation of fables, or a book of such expositions, and its first attested appearance in English is in John Lydgate's Troy book. From about 1425, of all the places the word could have surfaced, it surfaced in a poem about Troy. From Lydgate until the 17th or 18th century, mythology in English meant a moral, a fable, an allegory or parable, or a collection of traditional stories understood to be false. It was eventually applied to similar bodies of story among other peoples. And here is the small oddity in the sequence. Mythology entered English before. Myth. Did Johnson's dictionary has an entry for mythology and none for myth. The Greek loanword Mythos and the Latinate Mythos both appeared in the language before the first recorded example of myth. In 1830, the study of the thing had a name in English for 4 centuries before the thing itself did. What restored the material was not piety, but a change of temper, and it began at the end of the 18th century. Some scholars regard the genesis of the modern understanding of Greek mythology as a double reaction against the traditional attitude of Christian animosity, the long habit in which myth had been kept on the shelf only as lie or fable. In Germany, by about 1795, interest in Homer and in Greek mythology was growing quickly. At Göttingen, Johann Matthias Gesner had begun to revive Greek studies, and his successor, Christian Gottlob Hehner, working alongside Johann Joachim Winckelmann, laid the foundations of mythological research in Germany and beyond it. About 100 years later, the interest was still alive. Hermann Steuding published his Griechische und römische Götter- und Heldensage in 1897. Then a method arrived to go with the enthusiasm. Comparative philology developed through the 19th century, and ethnological discoveries followed in the 20th, and between them they established what can fairly be called the science of myth. Since the Romantics, all study of myth has been comparative. No story examined alone, every story set beside its cousins. Wilhelm Mannhardt, James Fraser, and Stith Thompson used that approach to collect and classify the themes of folklore and mythology, sorting motifs the way a botanist sorts specimens. In 1871, Edward Burnett Tyler published Primitive Culture, applying the comparative method to explain the origin and evolution of religion, and his procedure, drawing together the material culture, the ritual, and the myth of widely separated peoples, went on to influence both Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. Max Müller applied the new comparative science and found in myth the distorted remains of what he called Aryan nature worship, tracing an Indo-European form back toward an original manifestation. In 1891, he made his famous claim that the most important discovery of the 19th century concerning the ancient history of mankind was a single equation, Sanskrit. Diaus Pitar equals Greek Zeus equals Latin Jupiter equals Old Norse Tyr. One sky father, spoken 4 ways by peoples who had long since stopped understanding each other. Others turned from origins to function. Bronisław Malinowski emphasized the ways myth fulfills common social purposes, what a story does for the group that keeps telling it. Claude Lévi-Strauss and the structuralists compared the formal relations and patterns of myths across the world, looking past the content to the arrangement. Sigmund Freud brought in a transhistorical and biological conception of man and a view of myth as an expression of repressed ideas. Dream interpretation is the foundation of the Freudian reading, and his notion of dream work recognizes how much the meaning of any single element depends on its context, a suggestion that would offer an important point of rapprochement between the structuralist and psychoanalytic approaches. Carl Jung extended the psychological line further, proposing the collective unconscious and the archetypes that arise from it, inherited patterns often encoded in myth. Myth-forming structural elements, he held, must be present in the unconscious psyche. Karl Kerényi, one of the founders of modern studies in Greek mythology, gave up his own earlier views in order to apply Jung's theory of archetypes to the Greek material, a scholar changing his mind late, publicly, and rebuilding on someone else's flaw. Robert Siegel marks the difference between two of those airs with a fine edge. To interpret a myth, Campbell simply identifies the archetypes in it, an interpretation of the Odyssey would show how Odysseus's life conforms to a heroic pattern. Jung, by contrast, considers the identification of archetypes merely the first step. Naming the pattern is where one man finished and the other began. And while the scholars sorted and argued, the stories themselves were doing what they had always done, which is to say they were being told again, by people who had no interest whatever in method. The spread had begun long before any of that. The Greek myths passed out of the Hellenistic world when they were taken up into the culture of ancient Rome, and from there they never stopped moving. Western cultural movements have incorporated them again and again ever since, and especially since the Renaissance. Set beside the Bible and the classic saturated work of Shakespeare, the myths of Greece and of Rome have been the major touchstone in Western culture for the past 500 years. The common stock of images that a writer could reach for and expect a reader to catch. What gets borrowed varies enormously in weight. Gods of every stature, and humans and demigods, titans, giants, monsters, nymphs, and famed locations. Sometimes the borrowing is nothing more than a brief allusion, a name dropped into a line for the shading it brings with it. Sometimes an actual Greek figure walks into a work as a character and stays for the length of it. And a great many of the creatures have been worn down into types rather than persons, centaurs and nymphs, used generically, a nymph rather than that nymph, the one who lived in the spring at the bottom of a particular field and had a name that a particular village knew. The old localism, which was the whole texture of the thing, is the first quality to go when a story travels. Medieval Europe took the material without having the material. Its writers were unacquainted with Homer at first hand. The Greek was beyond reach, and the poems with it, and what they had instead were the Latin pseudo-chronicles, the supposed eyewitness reports going under the names of Dictis and Dares. And out of those second-hand accounts, they built something remarkably alive. They found in the Troy legend a rich source of heroic and romantic storytelling, and, just as usefully, a convenient framework into which they could fit their own courtly and chivalric ideals. Knights before the walls, love pledged and betrayed inside a siege, the manners of a 12th century hall laid over a Bronze Age coastline. Two of them can be named. Benoit de Saint-Maur composed the Roman de Troyes, the Romance of Troy, between 1154 and 1160. Joseph of Exeter wrote De Bello Troiano on the Trojan War in 1183. Both describe the war, and both rewrite the standard version they had found in their sources, and in doing so they were following Horace's advice and Virgil's example. The instruction was to rewrite a poem of Troy rather than to tell something wholly new, not originality as later ages would define it, fidelity to a subject and freedom within it. Consider for a moment how odd that inheritance looks from the outside. A Greek oral tradition, fixed into two poems by someone whose name may belong to no one, summarized by a Roman-era scholar, faked into chronicles by writers pretending to have stood on the plain, translated into medieval French and Latin by men who had never seen a line of the original, and read as a manual of courtly love. At every stage, the story arrives distorted, and at every stage, it is treated as the true one. And the distortion is not a failure of the transmission. The distortion is the transmission. That is how the material has always moved. Dante placed Homer inside his own poem without ever having read him, and had Virgil name him poet sovereign, king of all poets. Centuries later, in the preface to his translation of the Iliad, Alexander Pope simply acknowledged what everyone had long since agreed, that Homer has always been considered the greatest of poets. Neither man had access to what the earliest audiences had. Both of them knew exactly whose shadow they were standing in. The historian T.P. Wiseman, writing of the Roman side of the inheritance, put its persistence in terms that are hard to improve on. The stories still matter, he says, as they mattered to Dante in 1300 and to Shakespeare in 1600 and to the founding fathers of the United States in 1776. And the questions he attaches to them are not antiquarian ones. What does it take to be a free citizen? Can a superpower still be a republic? How does well-meaning authority turn into murderous tyranny? Those are the questions people brought to the material, century after century, and the material answered because it had been made, originally, by people asking how power passes and what it costs to hold. In our own time, the retelling has become a recognized genre of its own. Stories from the classic Greek material are placed in contemporary settings, or in futurist ones, and the aim described for the form is to combine mythological themes, birth, death, love, with modern philosophies of feminism and empowerment. Those aims belong to the retellers, not to the ancient sources. Nothing in Hesiod or the Sickle was reaching for them. What the retellings borrow is the cast and the situation. What they supply is a question the old poems were not asking. The earliest of them chose a figure who had been standing at the edge of the story all along. Cassandra, the daughter of Priam who warned about the horse and was not believed, became the main character twice over. The Ukrainian writer Lesia Ukrainka wrote a play, Cassandra. In 1908, and in East Germany, Christa Wolf published a novel in 1983. A woman whose defining trait in the tradition is that nobody listens to her, given, at last, the whole length of a book to speak in. Then Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad. In 2005, telling the events of the Odyssey through the tragedy of Penelope, the wife at the far end of that 10-year wandering, whose waiting is a fact in the older poem and a subject in the newer one. It appeared as part of the Canongate myth series, in which contemporary authors were invited to rewrite ancient myths, which is the medieval habit revived with a publisher's contract attached. Ursula K. Le Guin's Lavinia, in 2008, went further out to the margin still, a retelling of the Aeneid through the eyes of a minor female character, someone the original poem barely pauses on, Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles. In 2011, is set inside the Trojan War and was the first book to which the term for the genre was applied. It found its readership through its focus on relationships the older sources treat quite differently. Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls belongs to the same movement. The title itself, an argument about what the epics leave out. Stephen Fry's Mythos, in 2017, gathers a number of the Greek tales and retells them in a modern register, which is the oldest job in this whole tradition. Someone standing up and going through the stories in the language his audience actually speaks. And Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson. Books put the gods and their children into the modern world outright. Demigods with ordinary childhoods, the Immortals still quarreling, the whole machinery of Olympus running in the present tense. Riordan went on to do the same with Norse and with Egyptian material. A child reading those books is doing something structurally identical to what a Greek child did while looking at the figures on a painted jar, absorbing a cast of characters before ever meeting a text about them. If you are drifting now, that is exactly right, and there is very little left to hold on to. Because here is the thing. The long argument finally shows. The Greeks put their own myths on trial, in the philosophers' books, in the historians' method, on their own stages, and the myths survived the verdict. They survived it because they were never only claims about what had happened. A claim can be refuted. What the stories actually were is the shape a people gave to the unanswerable, the void that has no floor and no maker, the fact that even a king of the gods stands under something he did not set and cannot revise, the crack in a hillside that a farmer walked past every day of his life, which had to lead somewhere, and which the songs said led down. None of those are questions that a better method retires. Xenophanes was right that the gods in the poems behave badly, and it changed nothing because nobody had gone to the poems for a model of good conduct. They had gone for a way of saying what a person is, standing on the ground, under weather, with a fixed end coming. Plato could call it chatter, and then write a vision of the world beyond death to replace it. That substitution is the clearest evidence there is of what the material was for. And the stories outlasted every attempt to fix them in place, which may be the deepest thing about them. Walter Burkert noticed that the roster of heroes, unlike the roster of gods, was never given fixed and final form. Great gods are no longer born, he says, but new heroes can always be raised up from the army of the dead. The list stayed open. The birth poem of the gods, for all its authority, was one man's snapshot of a tradition already in motion, and the motion continued past him. There was no council to close the canon, no center to appeal to, only cities and their own customs, resembling one another the way accents resemble one another. So the retellings are not a departure from the tradition, they are the tradition, still doing the only thing it has ever done. A painter puts a jewel on a jar and does not label it. A rhapsode stands up at a competition and sings the god into the room before he begins. A 12th century clerk gives Trojan princes the manners of his own court. A novelist hands the Odyssey to the woman who stayed home. Each of them received the material altered and passed it on altered, and each of them believed they were telling it faithfully, and in the only sense that has ever applied, each of them was. That is what a living story looks like from the inside. Not a text preserved, a thing continually re-said by people who needed it for their own night, in their own language, about their own fear. And now let all of it go quiet. Imagine the bright summit of Olympus far behind you now, its councils and its rivalries no longer pressing on your thoughts, and the unseen realm beneath the world further behind still, its long darkness no nearer than a story told and finished. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the realm of gods and heroes, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the ancient quarrels of Titans and Olympians in calm and order. Then see one small flame, steady in the darkness, no bigger than the light a farmer carried across a yard. With a slow, gentle breath, let that flame go out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.